There is a moment right at the bottom of everything we know about Rick Sanchez, where a much younger man is sitting alone in his car in a dark garage, and a portal tears open in the air in front of him, and something small drops through it. That something is a bomb, and it takes his wife and his baby daughter, and it is the last ordinary night this man will ever have. Almost everything Rick becomes after that, the drinking, the cruelty, the endless running, grows straight out of that garage, and yet we were made to wait 5 whole seasons before the moment was shown to us clearly. Tonight, we are going through all of it, the entire story of Rick Sanchez, from that garage to the man he is now, in order, slowly, the way you would tell it to someone drifting off. So get comfortable, turn the lights down low, we will be here a while, and if you have not subscribed to Papertown yet, it honestly does help us keep making these. Before we go back to the beginning, it helps to get our bearings on exactly who this man is, because the name Rick Sanchez does not point to one person the way most names do. Rick and Morty is built around an infinite multiverse, an endless stack of parallel realities, and in almost every one of them there is a Rick Sanchez, a version of the same brilliant, damaged old man living a slightly different version of the same life. So when we say we are telling the story of Rick, we have to be careful about which Rick we mean. Our Rick has a label. He is Rick C-137, and that tag C-137 is the name of his original home dimension, the reality he was born into. Across the endless field of Ricks, he is the one the series follows, the one who moves into a suburban garage and starts dragging his grandson through the cosmos. And he is treated by other Ricks and by the writers alike as something like the definitive version, the Rickest Rick, as the fandom likes to put it. The smartest man in the universe. That phrase is one you will hear again and again, and I want to flag something about it right at the start because it sounds like a simple boast and turns out to be a trap. For most of the series, you are invited to take it at face value. Rick can build a portal gun that opens doorways between realities. He can turn himself into a pickle for a laugh and then claw his way out of a sewer using rat corpses as a mech suit. He can casually enslave whole civilizations to charge a car battery. Nothing in his path seems capable of stopping him, and the early seasons lean on that hard. But the actual scope of his genius is narrower than the phrase suggests, and eventually the writing admits it. He is not the smartest being in all of infinity. He is the smartest within a specific, walled-off slice of the multiverse, a region we will come back to in detail. And outside that wall, the title means nothing at all. Hold on to that, because it is the crack in the foundation that the whole back half of the story is built on top of. The other thing to understand before we start is that Rick is written in layers, and the writing is very deliberate about which layer it shows you at any given time. There is the surface Rick, the burping, drinking, cartoon god who treats the universe like a toy and everyone in it like a nuisance. There is the Rick underneath that one, slowly revealed to be running from something specific, a grief so large he built an entire cosmology to avoid looking at it. And there is the Rick the other characters have to live with, the grandfather, the father, the friend, the one whose presence in a room can be the best or the worst thing that happens to the people who love him, sometimes in the same afternoon. The whole arc of the series and the whole arc of this video is really about those layers peeling back one at a time until you finally get to the man in the garage. So that is where we are headed. But to understand why that man breaks the way he breaks, we have to meet him before he was broken. And that means going all the way back to a version of Rick you have almost never seen. Rick when he was happy. Rick's true origin was, for a long time, the biggest hole in the series. For the first several seasons, you knew almost nothing about where he came from. He arrived on screen already old, already drinking, already the most dangerous thing in any room, with no visible past and no interest in explaining himself. That was a deliberate choice, and the writers even played games with it, which we will get to. But the version the series finally settled on, the one it treats as the real history of Rick C-137, is this. Long before any of the adventures you know, Rick was a young scientist and inventor living in dimension C-137, and he was not alone. He had a wife, Diane Sanchez, and an infant daughter named Beth. And by every indication we are given, in those years he was something the present-day Rick has spent his whole life pretending to be above. He was ordinary, and he was in love, and he was happy. This is the version of Rick that almost nobody talks about, and it is the one I keep circling back to because everything cruel and grandiose about the man he becomes reads completely differently once you know it was built on top of a normal, tender domestic life. The glimpses come in fragments, mostly in the 5th season finale, and they are almost unbearably gentle. A young Rick with a full head of hair and no exhaustion in his face. A wife he is clearly devoted to. A baby daughter, the first Beth, the original Beth, a child who will not survive the story. There is a warmth in these images that the present Rick would sneer at if he saw it in anyone else. And the whole tragedy of his character is that he did have it, and he lost it, and he decided the correct response to losing it was to become someone for whom it could never happen again. Now, the young Rick of Dimension C-137 was already a genius, but here's the detail that matters most, and it is the one people most often get backwards. He was a genius who had failed. The specific thing he was chasing, the thing that would later define him and every other version of him across the multiverse, was interdimensional portal travel, the ability to punch a hole from one reality into another and step through. And in his home dimension, working alone, young Rick could not crack it. He tried and he failed repeatedly. This matters for 2 reasons. The first is that portal travel, the signature power of the entire franchise, did not come to Rick as a gift or a birthright. He was, for a period, a man who wanted the key to the multiverse and simply could not find it, and that failure is the hinge the whole tragedy swings on. The second reason is that it sets up a comparison the series will later make devastating use of, because there was one other version of Rick, out in the infinite field of them, who did crack it on his own, with no help from anyone. Our Rick was one of only 2 who managed it that way. And the other one is the man about to walk into this story and end young Rick's happy life forever. I want to slow down on the failure itself because the writing is doing something unusually precise with it. Here is a man the series keeps calling the smartest in existence, and the foundational fact of his life is a problem he could not solve. Read one way, that is just tragic irony. Read another way, and I think this is the reading being reached for. It is the source of everything. The present Rick has decided he can solve anything, treats every situation as a puzzle beneath him, and uses his intelligence as a wall against feeling. Underneath that posture sits the memory of a young man who was not smart enough, not fast enough, not in time. The godlike competence he performs for the rest of the series is, in this reading, a lifelong overcorrection against the one moment his mind was not enough to protect the people he loved. He never wants to be that helpless again, so he becomes a person for whom helplessness is theoretically impossible. It does not work, of course. Nothing he builds ever fixes the thing it was built to fix. But you cannot understand the drinking or the arrogance or the refusal to ever admit he needs anyone until you understand that they are all monuments to a failure he can never take back. There is one more thing to establish about this period, and it is a piece of vocabulary the series cares a great deal about. The dimension he came from is called C-137. You will hear that designation used as if it is simply Rick's name, his serial number. And functionally, that is how it works. But it originally refers to the reality, the specific branch of the infinite multiverse where this particular Rick was born and where his wife and daughter lived and died. Keeping that straight is going to matter because a very deliberate trick is coming involving which dimension is which. And a lot of viewers, and honestly, a lot of people making videos about all this, have gotten tangled in it. So plant a flag here. Rick is C-137. That is his home. That is where the happy version of him lived. And that home is about to be poisoned in a way no amount of genius will ever undo, by a knock on the garage door from a man wearing his own face. So let us talk about that man, because no one shapes Rick's life more, not Morty, not Beth, and for most of the series you do not even know his name. Fans, and eventually the writers, settle on calling him Rick Prime. He is a Rick, another version of the same man from another branch of the multiverse, and he is the one who solved portal travel on his own, the same feat our Rick eventually matches. At some point, Rick Prime went traveling. He started moving between realities, visiting other versions of himself, and one of the versions he visited was the young, happy, still grieving nothing Rick of Dimension C-137, the man in the garage with the wife and the baby. The series is careful about how it stages this, and the details matter, so I want to lay them out plainly and mark clearly what is confirmed and what is inference. What we are shown is that Rick Prime came to young Rick with an offer. He had working portal technology, the very thing young Rick had failed to build, and he presented it, in a sense, recruiting, inviting this version of himself to come along. to abandon the small domestic life and step into the infinite, and young Rick said no. This is the choice the entire franchise pivots on, and it is worth sitting with how strange and how human it is. Offered the keys to all of reality by a version of himself, a younger, still hopeful Rick chose his wife and his daughter and his ordinary life over the multiverse. He chose the small thing. He chose to stay. And Rick Prime could not stand it. The writing frames his reaction as something close to contempt, an offense taken at the idea that any version of himself would value a wife and a kitchen and a baby over the infinite. What he does next is the original sin of the whole story. He drops a bomb through a portal into that garage, and it kills Diane and it kills the original Beth. We saw the shape of this in the opening, the portal, the small object falling, the last ordinary night, so I will not walk through it again, beat by beat. What I want to add is the part that turns a tragedy into the specific engine of Rick's character, and it is the almost offhand cruelty of it. This was not a war, it was not a rivalry between equals. It was one version of a man annihilating another version's entire reason for living because that other version had dared to love something. Rick Prime did not need anything young Rick had. He killed Diane and Beth to make a point, and then he left, and he did not think about it again. For him it was Tuesday, for our Rick it became the center of the universe. There is a survivor's detail here that I find genuinely haunting. Young Rick lives through it. The reason he lives is almost unbearably mundane. He was sitting in his car when the bomb came through and the car shielded him, and so the one member of the family who survives the attack is the one it was aimed at, the one whose refusal caused it. He is left alive, in a garage, with the two people he loved most reduced to nothing, holding the knowledge that they died because he said no to a version of himself. If you have ever wondered why the present Rick treats his own survival as a kind of joke, why he is so casual about death, so contemptuous of the idea that any single life matters, I would point you right here. The man learned in the worst possible way that being spared is not the same as being saved. I said earlier that the writers played games with this origin, and this is the place to explain it, because it is one of the sharpest and most argued over pieces of writing in the series. The murder of Diane and Beth is not revealed cleanly or early. In the third season premiere, an episode called The Rick Shank Redemption, Rick appears to tell this exact story, the dead wife, the dead daughter, the vow of revenge, while he is hooked up to a mind probe run by the Galactic Federation, and then he pulls the rug out and says it was a fabrication, a fake memory he invented on the spot to distract his interrogator while he engineered his escape. So for 2 whole seasons after that, the audience was left to assume the tragic origin was a lie, a con, exactly the kind of manipulative, sentimental story Rick would weaponize against an enemy dumb enough to believe he had feelings. And then, the 5th season finale, Rick Mirai Jack, comes back around and reveals that the story was true after all. The wife, the daughter, the bomb, the other Rick, all of it real. What Rick did in that interrogation was hide his deepest wound by telling the exact truth and daring the world to believe it was a lie. That is such a precise piece of character writing that I have to stop and admire it. His defense mechanism is so total that he can confess the worst thing that ever happened to him and have it read as manipulation. He weaponizes his own grief as a disguise for his grief. Nobody talks about how bleak that is. What Rick does after the garage is the second great turning point, and it is the one that transforms him from a grieving widower into the force of nature we spend 7 seasons with. Alone, in the wreckage of his life, he finally solves the problem he had failed at for years. He invents portal travel. And I want to point at the awful symmetry of that because the writing clearly intends it. The thing he could not build to satisfy his curiosity or to impress the world, or even to accept as a gift from another version of himself, he builds in the aftermath of losing everything because now he has a use for it. He does not want to explore the multiverse. He wants to hunt through it. Grief, not wonder, is what finally sharpens him into the mind the whole series stands in awe of. He becomes capable of anything the moment he stops having anything to lose. And what he does with that capability for a very long time is look for Rick Prime. This is the through line most casual viewers miss for years because the series buries it under adventures and jokes. But underneath the surface, from before the premiere, our Rick is on a revenge hunt. He is crossing realities, chasing the one specific version of himself who murdered his family. And the multiverse is so vast and Ricks are so numerous and so good at hiding that the search takes decades and functionally never ends within his control. He does not find Rick Prime for the entire first act of his own life story. The hunt just becomes the shape of him. Here's the detail from this period I think is the darkest, and the writing does not flinch from it. Along the way, our Rick kills other Ricks, a lot of them, because Rick Prime is a Rick, and Ricks are hard to tell apart, and because our Rick's rage does not discriminate very carefully, the search leaves a trail of dead versions of himself across the multiverse. There is a reading of this, and I think it is the correct one, where the revenge hunt is also a long, distributed suicide. Every Rick he kills is a version of himself. Every time he pulls the trigger on another Rick, he is rehearsing, on a body that wears his own face, the thing he half wishes had happened to him in that garage. The series will make this literal later, with an actual suicide attempt. But the groundwork is laid here, in a man who spends decades traveling the infinite specifically to destroy copies of himself in the name of finding the one copy he truly wants dead. That is not a hobby. That is a person at war with his own existence, using the entire multiverse as the battlefield. This is also the period where Rick becomes a legend among Ricks, and it is worth understanding how the others see him because it tells you how far gone he already is. To the wider society of Ricks, our Rick is not a hero and not quite a villain. He is a boogeyman. He is the Rick who will not play by the rules the others have agreed on, the one too dangerous and too unpredictable to sit at the table with. Part of that reputation is the revenge hunt, and part of it is what he does next, arguably his most consequential act ever, more so even than inventing portal travel, and something the writers hold back until very late. Our Rick does not just travel the multiverse, he reshapes it. He draws a line around a piece of infinity and closes it off, and in doing so he creates the very structure that every other Rick lives inside, whether they know it or not. That structure has a name, the Central Finite Curve, and it is strange and load-bearing enough that it deserves its own stretch of this story. But before we can understand the wall Rick built, we have to understand the city the Ricks built inside it, because the two are tangled together, and the city is where our Rick story stops being private grief and becomes cosmic politics. The Citadel of Ricks is one of the great inventions of the series, and it grows out of a simple, chilling premise. If there are infinite realities and nearly every one of them contains a Rick and a Morty, then there are effectively infinite Ricks and infinite Mortys, and they all have enemies. The Galactic Federation hunts them. Their own worst versions hunt them. And so, at some point, a great many Ricks and Mortys did the thing Ricks always do, which is build their way out of a problem. They pooled their genius and constructed a hidden city, a secret society outside of normal space. A place where Ricks and Mortys from across the multiverse could live together, safe from the outside universe, and, above all, safe from the deadliest Ricks of all. The Citadel is a refuge, but it is also a confession. It is proof that even Ricks, the beings who insist they need no one, could not survive alone, and so they clustered together for protection like anyone else. The Citadel was governed for a long time by a body called the Council of Ricks, an oligarchy of Ricks who set the rules and enforced them and decided which Ricks were acceptable and which were threats. If you want the fact about our Rick that says everything in the fewest words, it is this. He refused to join, offered a seat at the table by a society of himself, invited to help govern the greatest concentration of his own genius ever assembled. Our Rick said no, the same way young Rick said no to Rick Prime, and I do not think that Echo is an accident. He will not be one of many. He will not be governed, not even by other Ricks, not even by better organized versions of his own mind. The Council came to regard him as an outlaw, a rogue element, the Rick who would not be counted. And there is a running thread through the early seasons where the Council actively wants him dealt with, because a Rick who answers to no Rick is, by their logic, the deadliest thing in the multiverse. I find the pride in this almost unbearable, and I mean that as praise for the writing. Our Rick would rather be hunted by every version of himself than admit that any collective, even one made entirely of him, has authority over him. It is the same wound as the garage, expressed as politics. He lost everything once by being part of something small and vulnerable, a family, and his response has calcified into a total allergy to belonging to anything at all. The Council is not evil in any simple way. It is bureaucratic, self-interested, occasionally murderous, but mostly it is just a government. and Rick treats it the way he treats every structure that asks him to be accountable, which is as an insult to be destroyed at the first opportunity. Keep that in mind, because at the start of the third season, he gets that opportunity, and he takes it, and the results are catastrophic on a scale that is hard to overstate. The other thing the Citadel gives us, and this is where the private story and the cosmic story finally fuse, is Evil Morty. But we cannot do Evil Morty justice yet, because to understand what he is escaping from, you have to understand the wall around everything, the thing our Rick built. The reason he is smaller than his famous title makes him sound. So let us finally talk about the Central Finite Curve, because it reframes literally everything, including the phrase we have been circling since the very beginning. The Central Finite Curve is the concept that, once you understand it, quietly rewrites the whole series. Imagine the infinite multiverse, every possible reality, an endless field with every conceivable version of events playing out somewhere. In some of those realities, Rick is a genius. In others, he is a fool, or a saint, or a corpse, or was never born. Now imagine drawing a boundary, a wall that encloses only a specific subset of that infinity, the slice of realities in which Rick Sanchez is the smartest being alive. Cut away everything else. Keep only the universes where Rick wins. That enclosed region is the Central Finite Curve, and according to what the 5th season finale reveals, our Rick C-137, is the architect credited with building it. Take a second with the ego of that, because it is staggering, faced with an infinite multiverse in which he is, statistically, usually not the smartest thing around. Our Rick did not accept his place in it. He walled off the portion where he is always on top and made that walled garden the entire operating environment for himself. And without their consent, for every other Rick and Morty too. The Citadel, the Council, all of it exists inside his wall. Every Rick who ever looked down on him, every council member who declared him an outlaw, was living inside a cage he designed in a reality selected precisely so that a Rick would always be the apex mind. The whole society of Ricks is, in a sense, his terrarium. That is the kind of act that sounds like triumph and reads, the longer you look at it, like the deepest possible insecurity. A man so unable to bear the thought of being ordinary that he amputated the parts of infinity where he might be, and called the wound a home. And this is where we finally have to be honest about the phrase, the smartest man in the universe. Inside the Central Finite Curve, it is true. Rick really is the smartest being in every reality the wall contains, because the wall was drawn to make it true. But it is true the way a champion is undefeated in a tournament he personally rigged. Outside the curve, in the true and total infinity, the title is meaningless. There are realities out there with beings that would make Rick look like a child, and he knows it. And he built the wall specifically so he would never have to face them, or the version of himself they would produce. This is the crack in the foundation I pointed at in the very beginning, and now you can see the whole shape of it. Rick's supremacy is real, and it is also a lie, both at once. And the tension between those two facts is what the character is made of. It also sets up the greatest threat of his life, which does not come from an enemy at all, but from a Morty. Because if the Central Finite Curve is a prison Rick built to guarantee his own greatness, then the cruelest thing anyone could do to him is not to kill him. It is to break the wall, to escape into the true infinity where he is nothing special. And in doing so to prove that the whole structure of his life was a coward's fantasy. That is exactly what Evil Morty sets out to do, and it is why he is the perfect antagonist for this series, because he is not trying to beat Rick at Rick's game. He is trying to walk off the board entirely and to leave Rick standing on it, king of a cage. We will follow that all the way to its conclusion, but to do it properly, we need to rejoin Rick where the actual series picks him up. Decades into all of this, exhausted, drunk, legendary, and utterly alone, at the moment he does the strangest thing he has ever done. He decides to go home, not to C-137, which is a graveyard, to someone else's home, to a family that is almost his. Somewhere in the long grind of the revenge hunt, our Rick did something that, on its surface, looks like giving up and underneath is anything but. He stopped and he moved in with a family, not his family. His original wife and daughter were dead, and because of what we will learn later about how thoroughly they were erased, there was no going back to them anywhere. But the multiverse is infinite, and it is full of Beth's adult versions of the daughter he lost, living out lives he never got to watch. And in one of those realities, there was a Beth, grown up, married to a man named Jerry, with 2 children, Summer and Morty, and a Rick-shaped absence in her life, because that reality's own Rick had left long ago and never come back. Our Rick crash-landed into that gap. He took the empty chair. He became the grandfather in a house that was almost, but not quite, the one he lost. This is one of the more emotionally complicated things Rick ever does, and the series is smart enough to never let it be simple. On one level, it is unbearably sad, an old man so hollowed out by grief that he has traveled across infinity to find a copy of his dead daughter and stand in the doorway of a life he can pretend is his. On another level, it is deeply selfish because he is inserting himself into a functioning family, one that had made its peace with his absence, and he will spend years destabilizing it, endangering the children, undermining the marriage, treating all of them as props in his own private theater of avoidance. And on a third level, the one the series keeps almost hidden, there is a strategic reason he chose this particular family in this particular dimension, a reason tied directly to Rick Prime that will not become clear until much later. For now, hold the mystery. Rick did not land in this garage at random. He landed here on purpose, and the purpose was the hunt. Which brings us to Morty and to the coldest fact at the center of the warmest relationship in the series. Why does Rick keep Morty? Not just tolerate him, but insist on him, drag him on every adventure, refuse to go anywhere without him? The early seasons give you a sentimental answer, and then, late in the first season, in an episode called Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, they replace it with a clinical one. A Rick's hyper-intelligent brain gives off a distinctive signal, a kind of genius brainwave that can be tracked across realities. And a Morty's brainwaves do the opposite. They naturally cancel a Rick's out, blanketing that signal, hiding the Rick who stands next to him. In the series' own terms, a Morty is camouflage. The original functional reason our Rick keeps this boy at his side is that the boy makes him invisible to his enemies. Morty is not a companion. He is a cloaking device with a face. This is a place where a lazy read goes badly wrong, so let me draw the line clearly. The camouflage explanation is the origin of the relationship, not the truth of it as it stands now. What makes Rick and Morty, the actual bond, so devastating is that it starts as pure utility and then refuses to stay that way. Over the seasons, against everything Rick claims to believe, against his whole philosophy that nothing matters and no one is special, the old man ends up loving this specific, ordinary, easily frightened grandson. And it terrifies him because he built his entire post-garage existence on the principle of never again caring about something small enough to lose. Morty is exactly the size of thing that can be taken from him. The tragedy is that Rick knows it and cannot make himself stop. And the whole series is, in one sense, the slow-motion story of a man discovering that the escape hatch he built out of a child has a heart, and that his own has started beating again in spite of him. That is the man the series meets in its first episode. So let us finally start watching it happen, season by season, and see how the story it tells forward keeps circling back to that garage we started in. Rick and Morty premiered on Adult Swim on December 2nd, 2013, created by Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland, and the first season does something clever with everything we have just laid out. It hides it. When you meet Rick in that first episode, you get none of the backstory. You get a drunk old man barging into his grandson's bedroom in the middle of the night, flask in hand, spit flying, announcing that he needs a co-pilot for something dangerous. And you laugh, and you have no idea you are looking at the survivor of the worst crime in the multiverse. The genius of the early episodes is that the tragedy is fully loaded and completely invisible. Everything I have told you is already true of the man on screen. He just is not telling you, and he is not going to for a long time. The first season is mostly episodic, a display of how casually monstrous Rick can be, but it plants 2 enormous seeds. The first is Evil Morty. Late in the season, in Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, the same episode that gives us the camouflage explanation, Ricks across the multiverse are being murdered, and the Council of Ricks blames our Rick, and the trail leads to a version of Rick living off the grid with a strangely obedient Morty. That Rick turns out to be a puppet. The real mastermind is his Morty, a Morty wearing an eye patch who has been controlling a Rick rather than serving one. and who, when his plan collapses, simply slips away into the crowd of identical Mortys and disappears. Nobody at the time understood what they had just watched. A Morty, the supposedly disposable half of the equation, had out-schemed a Rick and walked away clean. That eye patch Morty is evil Morty, and the writers planted him in the very first season and then let him sit, mostly unseen, for years, which is a level of patience you rarely see on television. The second seed is the one that told the audience what kind of show this really was, and it is an episode called Rick Potion Number 9. Morty wants a girl at school to like him, so Rick whips up a love serum, and it goes catastrophically wrong. The serum mutates, jumps from person to person, and eventually transforms the entire population of Earth into grotesque, twisted creatures the fans came to call Cronenbergs. And Rick's solution to having ruined an entire planet is the single bleakest joke the series had told up to that point. He does not fix it. He decides the Earth is a write-off, opens a portal to a neighboring reality, one that is nearly identical, except that in that version, it's Rick and Morty have just died in a lab accident, and he and his Morty step through, bury their own dead counterparts in the backyard, and take their places. The family in that new reality never knows the difference. And Morty, this 14-year-old boy, has to help dig the graves and then sit down to dinner with a mother and father and sister who are not technically his own. I want to be precise about this because the continuity here is one of its worst understood corners, and it runs the opposite way to how people usually remember it. The Cronenberged Earth that Rick abandons is not some random reality he stumbled through. It is his and Morty's true original home. It is Dimension C-137, the same reality Rick was born in, the same reality where Diane and the first Beth once lived and died. The near-identical world they portal into to replace it, the one where a Rick and a Morty had just died in a lab accident, is the borrowed one, the foreign one, and years later the series will reveal that this replacement dimension is not a random choice either. For now, hold the shape of it. From this episode onward, the Morty we follow is a boy who has already watched his own world end and moved into a substitute, and the Beth and Jerry and Summer we spend the series with are, from that Morty's point of view, stand-ins for a family he buried. He is never allowed to fully process it. It is played for a grim laugh and then folded back into the sitcom. But it is doing something enormous underneath. It is telling you that here, characters are not protected, worlds are disposable, and the people you love can be swapped for near-identical copies without the plot even slowing down. That is a terrifying thing to establish in your 6th episode, and it is why the argument that nothing matters in this show has real teeth. The nihilism was earned early, and then the series spent the rest of its run quietly arguing with it. The first season also gives us the phrase that became Rick's signature, and for a while the series' own, and I love how it buries a gut punch inside a catchphrase. Rick's rallying cry is Wubba Lubba Dub Dub, and for most of the first season it just sounds like nonsense, a drunk man's whoop. And then, in the first season finale, set at a house party, an episode called Rixie Business, Rick's oldest friend, Bird Person, a stoic alien warrior, hears it and translates it. In Bird Person's language, Wubba Lubba Dub Dub means, I am in great pain, please help me. The joke everyone had been laughing along with for a whole season was a cry for help hiding in plain sight, which is, when you think about it, the entire character in 5 syllables. Now, I will note that the series later complicates this, and by the 8th season, Rick pushes back on the idea that he was ever literally begging for rescue, reframing it as more of a shared bit between old friends than a confession. Both framings are worth holding, but the fact that the writers chose, this early, to reveal that Rick's happiest sounding noise is a distress signal tells you they knew exactly who this character was from the start, even while they were still pretending he was just a party animal with a portal gun. The second season, which aired across the summer and fall of 2015, is where the series starts letting the sadness leak through on purpose, and it contains what I would argue is the darkest beat in the character's entire run. It comes in an episode called Autoerotic Assimilation, and it involves an old flame of Rick's named Unity. Unity is not a person in the usual sense. Unity is a hive mind, a single consciousness that spreads by assimilating entire populations, taking over every individual on a planet and running them as one being. And Rick and Unity have a history, a genuine one, because Unity is one of the very few entities in all of existence that operates on Rick's level. that can meet him as an equal that he does not have to dumb himself down for or perform around. When they reunite, Rick is briefly something close to joyful. He and Unity essentially throw a civilization-sized party together. And then Unity leaves him. Unity writes him a goodbye letter, and the reason it gives is the reason that matters. Unity says that being around Rick makes it worse, that he drags it toward the same self-destruction he lives in, that to stay healthy, it has to get away from him. This is a being made of entire worlds telling Rick that he is too toxic to be near. And what Rick does in response is the beat I warned you about. He goes back to the garage and he methodically builds a device and he sets it up to vaporize his own head, and he sits down in front of it to end his life. The only reason he survives is that he passes out drunk before the machine fires. It does not soften this. It does not turn it into a joke at the last second. It just shows you the smartest mind in his walled slice of infinity, alone in a garage, having built one more machine, this one designed to make him stop existing, and failing even at that because he is too drunk to stay conscious for his own death. Almost nobody was ready for that scene, and the series never really refers back to it directly, which somehow makes it heavier. It just sits in the middle of the second season, a permanent piece of information about who this man is when the adventures stop. I linger on it because everything else about Rick has to be read through it. The arrogance, the drinking, the cruelty, the God complex, all of it is the exterior of a man who, given a quiet enough moment and a bad enough rejection, will try to kill himself in the same room where his family died. The garage is not a coincidence. The series keeps putting his lowest moments in that specific space, the workshop, the place where he builds, and I do not think that is accidental. Building is how Rick avoids feeling, and when the building finally turns on himself, it turns in the one room where the original wound lives. The second season is not all despair, though, and it also gives us one of the purest displays of Rick as a casual god who abuses entire universes without a flicker of guilt. In an episode called The Ricks Must Be Crazy, we learn that Rick's spaceship runs on a microverse battery, and the battery is a real, populated universe, a tiny cosmos full of intelligent beings that Rick created and then tricked into building a power grid, a grid whose true purpose, unknown to them, is to charge his car. They worship him as a benevolent visitor from the sky. He is, in fact, farming their entire civilization for electricity. And it goes deeper because inside that microverse, a brilliant local scientist named Zeep has done the exact same thing, built his own miniature universe to steal power from, and inside that one there is another, a teenyverse, an infinite regress of one intelligent species enslaving the next for cheap energy. It is one of the fullest statements of Rick's morality the series ever makes. To Rick, a universe is a battery if it is smaller than him, and almost everything is smaller than him. There is no line, there is only scale. The second season also introduces a character who seems like a throwaway and becomes something stranger, Mr. Poopy Butthole, in an episode called Total Recall. The premise is that alien parasites have infested the house, and they spread by implanting fake happy memories, so that everyone suddenly remembers beloved friends and relatives who never actually existed. The way to tell a parasite from a real person is that parasites can only generate pleasant memories, while real people come with bad memories too. And the whole joke, the thing people still get wrong, is that Mr. Poopy Butthole, this cheerful little creature who looks exactly like the kind of thing a parasite would invent, turns out to be completely real. He is the one genuine friend in a house full of fakes, and the family shoots him anyway, because they cannot believe something that pleasant could be real. He survives, and he goes on to become a recurring figure at the edges of the story, a friend who checks in, who narrates, who has his own small, sad ups and downs. Keep him in mind because his fate becomes an open question much later, right at the current edge of the series. And then the second season ends by pulling the floor out. In the finale, the wedding squanchers, Rick's oldest friend, Bird Person, is getting married to a human woman named Tammy, and the whole strange family of Rick's life gathers to celebrate, which is already a rare and tender thing to see. And it is a trap. Tammy is revealed to be an undercover agent of the Galactic Federation, the interstellar government that has been hunting Rick, and the wedding is an ambush. Tammy kills Bird Person, Rick's closest friend, in cold blood in the middle of his own wedding, and the Federation moves to capture Rick and everyone he loves. And Rick, cornered out of options with his family's safety on the line, does the last thing anyone expected from him. He turns himself in, he surrenders to the Federation to spare the others, and the season ends with Rick in a Federation prison and Earth itself under alien occupation. It is the lowest the series had ever put him, and it looks, for a whole hiatus, like defeat. It was not, it was a plan. But to understand the plan, we have to cross into the third season, which is where Rick goes from being a character the universe happens to and becomes, for one terrifying episode, a character who happens to the universe. The third season, which arrived in 2017 with a now legendary surprise premiere on April Fool's Day, opens by revealing that Rick's surrender was his most elaborate con ever. The premiere, the Rickdemption, is where Rick stops being a clever survivor and briefly becomes something closer to a god of destruction. From inside a Federation prison, hooked to that mind probe where he tells and then disowns his tragic origin, Rick body hops through a chain of stolen bodies, breaks out, and executes a plan of breathtaking scale. He teleports the entire Citadel of Ricks into the middle of a Federation stronghold, setting his two greatest enemies against each other at once. And then he does the thing that actually wins it. He does not fight the Galactic Federation with an army. He hacks their economy and sets the value of their currency, the Blemflark, to zero. In an instant, the government that occupied Earth and hunted him across the stars collapses, not from a bomb, but from bankruptcy, because Rick understood that a civilization runs on the shared fiction of money, and all he had to do was cancel the fiction. It is such a Rick way to win, and I think it is easy to miss how much it tells you about him. He does not beat the Federation by being stronger. He beats it by being more cynical than it is, by seeing that the whole thing was held together by a number in a database and having no reverence for the number. The same episode devastates the Council of Ricks, effectively ending that governing body for good. So in the span of one premiere, Rick dismantles both the alien empire and the society of his own kind that had opposed him. He is, for a moment, completely unopposed. And what does he do with total victory? He goes home and rearranges his family to suit himself. He engineers the divorce of Beth and Jerry, isolating Beth so that she is dependent on him, and he closes the episode crowing to Morty about his own genius, telling him Beth is not going anywhere, and claiming this whole adventure was really just to get the toppings for a discontinued fast food dipping sauce. That last part, the Szechuan sauce bit, became a real-world phenomenon, and it is worth flagging that Rick offers it as his motivation, almost as a taunt, a deliberately absurd cover for the fact that the real motivation was control. He would rather claim he did it all for a condiment than admit he did it to keep his daughter close. The third season is also where the series delivers its clearest statement of what is actually wrong with Rick, and it does it in the most ridiculous package imaginable, an episode called Pickle Rick. To get out of attending family therapy, Rick turns himself into a pickle. The middle of the episode is a gloriously violent action sequence involving the sewer and an improvised body made of dead animals, which I will leave where it is because the point of the episode is not the action. The point is the ending in the therapist's office where Dr. Wong, voiced by Susan Sarandon, quietly takes Rick apart. She tells him, in effect, that his intelligence is not the reason he avoids the boring work of relationships and mental health. It is the excuse. She points out that he has convinced himself his mind is either an unstoppable force or an unbearable curse, anything except an ordinary thing that he is responsible for managing, because as long as it is exceptional, he never has to do the mundane work of being a person. It is the thesis of the entire series delivered by a guest character to a pickle, and Rick's response is telling. He does not argue. He compliments her, and then he refuses to come back. He can hear the truth. He simply will not act on it. That gap between what Rick knows about himself and what he is willing to do about it is the whole tragedy in miniature. The third season also finally starts paying off Evil Morty in an episode called The Ricklantis Mix-Up, and it is one of the series' masterpieces. On the surface, it is a tour of ordinary life on the rebuilt Citadel of Ricks, following regular Ricks and Mortys through their jobs and struggles, a whole society of the same two people living out class and crime and politics. And running underneath it is an election. The Citadel, now a kind of democracy, is choosing a president, and a mysterious candidate, Morty, rises through the campaign on a message of hope and change, and wins, and is revealed in the final shot to be the same eye patch Morty from the very first season. Evil Morty is now president of the Citadel of Ricks, the ruler of the entire society of Ricks, having beaten them at the one game they never imagined a Morty could play, politics, and he takes power with almost no fanfare and begins turning the place into a dictatorship, all while every Rick in the building continues to underestimate every Morty in the building. The long fuse lit in the first season is now visibly burning towards something. And in the middle of all this cosmic machinery, the third season gives Rick his most intimate and unanswerable act in an episode called The ABCs of Beth. Beth, Rick's daughter, the adult version of the child he lost, is unhappy and afraid she has inherited her father's coldness, and Rick offers her an escape. He offers to make a clone of her, a perfect copy, so that one Beth can stay and raise the family while the other goes off to live a wild, free life in space, unburdened. Beth agonizes, and eventually one Beth leaves and one stays. And here's the detail that makes it unforgettable, and that you must never get wrong. Rick tells her, and later tells us, that to spare her the existential horror of knowing she was the copy, he scrambled the process so thoroughly that even he does not know which Beth is the clone and which is the original. It is unanswerable by design. The series will not tell you because Rick made sure it cannot know. From here on, there is an Earth Beth who stays with the family and a Space Beth who becomes a galactic rebel. And both of them are, canonically and equally, his daughter. Neither is more real than the other. It is one of the few truly kind things Rick ever does, wrapped inside one of its most unsettling, and it will echo all the way to the later seasons. The fourth season, which aired in 2 parts across 2019 and 2020, is a little looser and more experimental than what came before, but it clarifies a piece of Rick's biology that changes how you watch every dangerous thing he does. The premiere, Edge of Tomorty, pulls back the curtain on how Rick cheats death. It turns out he has a contingency, a system called Operation Phoenix, a network of pre-grown clone bodies waiting in reserve so that when a Rick dies, his consciousness can be uploaded into a fresh copy and he simply continues. The premiere makes this vivid and horrible by having a Rick die and then wake up again and again in a series of increasingly ridiculous backup bodies, a tiny shrimp version, a teddy bear version, a wasp version, hopping through spare shells until he can claw his way back to a proper one. I want to be careful about what this does and does not mean because it is easy to overread. It does not make Rick immortal in any casual sense. It is a specific, limited, high-maintenance backup system that has to be set up in advance and that the writing does not let him lean on for free. When you see Rick die in later episodes, you cannot simply assume he will pop back up. But it does add a permanent layer of unreality to his relationship with death, and I think it deepens the sadness rather than cheapening it. Here's a man who tried to kill himself in his garage, who spent decades destroying copies of himself across the multiverse, and who has also, coldly and practically, built a factory of his own replacement bodies, so that dying is, for him, mostly an inconvenience. He has made himself hard to kill precisely because, on some level, he wants to be dead and refuses to give himself the release. The clone bodies are not a power fantasy. They are a man denying himself even the exit he keeps reaching for. The fourth season also contains the episode I have to address directly because it is one this channel has gotten wrong before, and I want to state the facts cleanly. The episode is The Old Man in the Seat, and it is about a toilet. Rick, it turns out, maintains a private toilet, hidden away on a serene and beautiful alien planet, a secret spot where he goes to be completely alone, because the one thing this man who abuses whole universes cannot tolerate is the thought of another living being sharing his most private moment. The drama of the episode is that someone finds it. An alien named Tony discovers Rick's secret toilet and starts using it, and Rick is enraged because his sanctuary has been violated. Let me be as clear as possible because the detail matters and it has been flipped before. The toilet was Rick's. Tony was the intruder. Rick was not the one trespassing on someone else's spot. It was his private place, and Tony broke into it, and the whole episode is about Rick's fury at being intruded upon, and underneath that, his complete inability to let anyone get close. When Tony later dies, Rick, who spent the episode hating him, is quietly shaken because the one person who had, however rudely, shared his solitude is gone. It is a small episode about a toilet that is secretly about a man so walled off that even his loneliness has a no trespassing sign on it. That is the thread the fourth season keeps returning to, Rick's isolation, and it braids it back into the larger plot in the finale, an episode that brings Space Beth back into the story. Remember that one Beth went off into space to live free. She returns, now a battle-hardened galactic rebel, and the reunion forces the family to sit with the unanswerable question at the center of the clone plot, because here are two Beths, both real, both his daughter, and no way to rank them. The finale also brings back a figure from the wreckage of the second season's wedding, because Bird Person, killed by Tammy, did not stay simply dead. The Federation recovered his body and rebuilt it into a cyborg, a cold, mechanical version of Rick's oldest friend, now serving the very enemy that murdered him, a being the series calls Phoenix Person. Seeing his best friend reduced to a weaponized corpse is one more loss stacked onto Rick, and it sets up one of the most tender things he ever does, which happens in the following season, when he decides that this particular loss, unlike Diane, might actually be one he can undo. That decision is where the fifth season turns everything, so let us go there, because it is the season where the series finally stops hinting and tells you, at last, the whole truth about the man in the garage. The fifth season, which aired in 2021, is where the long game finally comes due, and it does it in 2 episodes near the end that belong among the best the series has produced. The first is Rickternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort, and it is Rick's attempt to bring Bird Person back. Bird Person, remember, exists at this point as Phoenix Person, a Federation cyborg built from his own corpse, and Rick, unwilling to leave his oldest friend as a weapon, ventures inside Bird Person's mind into the tangle of his memories to try to reach whatever is left of the person in there and wake him up. What that episode reveals is a friendship far deeper and older than we had understood, and it also opens more of Rick's own history through Bird Person's eyes. We learn about their years together as anti-Federation soldiers, the war they fought side by side, and we learn that Rick was, in those years, capable of a loyalty and a warmth he now performs contempt for. And we learn that even Bird Person, who loved him, saw the self-destruction clearly. Inside the memories, Rick has to confront the fact that his friend knew exactly who he was and stayed anyway, which is almost harder for Rick to bear than betrayal would be. The episode ends with Bird Person pulled back from the brink, restored, alive again in a real sense, and it stands as proof of something important about Rick that cuts against his whole nihilist pose. When it is a loss, he can actually reverse. He moves heaven and earth to reverse it. He does not shrug. He does not say nothing matters. He fights for his friend, which makes the loss he cannot reverse, Diane, land even harder, and the series knows it, and it is about to make that explicit. Because the season finale, Rick Murai Jack, is the episode where the series finally hands you everything. This is where the true origin, the one we open this whole story with, is laid out plainly and confirmed as real, no longer a memory Rick can disown in an interrogation room. The trigger is Evil Morty, who has been maneuvering all along and who now uses a device to pull Rick's genuine buried memories to the surface and pour them into our Morty's head, so that Morty and the audience finally see it all. The happy young Rick, Diane, the first Beth, the other Rick at the door, the bomb, the decades of revenge. The writing stops hiding, and in that same episode we get the full picture of what Rick built. The wall around the realities where he is the smartest, and we watch Evil Morty do the thing that Wall was never supposed to allow. He uses the accumulated power of the Citadel to punch a hole straight through the Central Finite Curve and step out of it, into the true infinity beyond, into the part of existence where Rick is not special and never was. I think this is as thematically perfect a climax as the series ever built, and I want to say why, without retreading the mechanics we already covered. Evil Morty does not defeat Rick by killing him or outfighting him. He defeats the idea of Rick. He proves, by simply leaving, that the entire structure of Rick's supremacy was a cage Rick built out of fear, and he refuses to live in it any longer. And the way he leaves is brutal. Breaking through the wall destroys the Citadel, the great gathered society of Ricks and Mortys, killing most of them in the process, so that evil Morty's freedom is bought with a slaughter of the very people who could never see him coming. He walks out into the real multiverse and closes the door behind him, and the last thing he says amounts to a dismissal, a declaration that he is done with Ricks and Mortys entirely, that he just wants to live somewhere the whole obsessive machine of their conflict cannot reach him. And then he is gone, and Rick is left standing in the ruins of everything he made, having watched a Morty do what no Rick ever dared, which is to want out. For Rick, the 5th season finale is a double blow that reframes his entire life. His deepest secret is finally exposed, dragged into the light in front of his own grandson, and at the same moment, the cosmic order he spent a lifetime constructing is shattered and shown to have been a prison all along. Everything he has, he now knows, was chosen, walled, curated by his own hand to keep him at the top and to keep the truth of Diane at the bottom. And the one enemy he has left, the one loose end, is the man who started all of it. The other Rick from the garage, still out there somewhere, never caught. So the series, having finally told us the beginning, pivots the 6th season toward the ending Rick has wanted since the first night of his life fell apart. It sends him back onto the hunt, but this time with the audience knowing exactly what is at stake. And this time, for the first time, with a real chance of catching the man he has been chasing across infinity. And it starts, appropriately, by sending Rick home to a dimension whose true identity he has been hiding from everyone, including, in a sense, himself. The 6th season, which aired in 2022, opens with the episode Solarix, and it resolves a mystery I asked you to hold on to much earlier. The question of why Rick chose this specific family in this specific dimension to move in with. The setup is a mess of Rick's own making. When evil Morty broke through the wall, the damage drained the fluid that powers Rick's portals, and as a side effect, it flung Rick, Morty, and Jerry back to their true original realities, snapping each of them home like a released rubber band. And in sorting out that mess, Rick finally says the thing out loud. The dimension where the series has been set all this time, the home of the Beth and the family we have followed for years, is not a random reality. It is Rick Prime's home dimension. The place Rick Prime came from. Take a moment with the strategy of that, because it is one of the coldest, most patient acts of Rick's entire life. Our Rick did not stumble into this family. He hunted for the specific dimension his enemy called home, and he moved in there, and he stayed for years, playing grandfather, going on adventures, building a whole domestic life, all as a kind of trap. He was living in the murderer's house, waiting for the murderer to come back. Every ordinary dinner, every school pickup, every stupid squabble with Jerry was happening on top of a stakeout that had been running for a decade. The family never knew they were bait. And I find that genuinely chilling because it means the closest thing Rick has to a home was chosen not for love, but for vengeance. And yet the love happened anyway, in spite of the reason, which is the whole contradiction of the man compressed into a single address. Solarix also delivers a small, cruel piece of Morty's story that deepens the tragedy of that first season dimension hop. When the snapback sends Morty to his true original reality, he lands on the ruined Cronenberg world, the Earth his own Rick abandoned all those years ago, and there he finds his original father, the Jerry he left behind, and that Jerry has become something horrible. Isolated and broken by the apocalypse Rick caused, this original Jerry has curdled into a bitter, nihilistic, almost Rick-like figure, and he rejects his own son. It is a grim mirror. Morty gets to see what his father becomes without a family to soften him, and it looks disturbingly like the very man who ruined them both. And then, in a post-credits stinger that relights the entire plot, Rick Prime appears on that ruined world and kills the Cronenberg Jerry, casually, the way he kills everything, announcing to the audience that the white whale is back in play and still every bit as monstrous as the story that opened this whole video. From there, the 6th season becomes, underneath its standalone adventures, the runway toward the confrontation Rick has waited his whole life for. It tightens the screws, brings Rick Prime closer, and lets you feel the change in Rick himself, because a man who has spent decades chasing a ghost reacts strangely when the ghost becomes real and reachable. There is a fear in Rick now that was not there before, and I think it is the fear of the day after. As long as Rick Prime is out there uncaught, Rick has a purpose, a reason to keep building, Keep drinking, keep going. The hunt is the scaffolding holding the man upright, and some part of Rick understands that catching Rick Prime will not bring Diane back, will not undo the garage, will not fix anything, and will instead remove the one structure that has organized his entire adult existence. The 6th season is Rick walking toward the thing he has always wanted while slowly realizing that getting it might destroy him more completely than never getting it ever could, which sets up the 7th season, where he gets it and where the series also has to reckon with something from the real world that no plot could have planned for, a change to the very voice of the character. Before we get to what happens to Rick in the 7th season, we have to pause on what happened to Rick and Morty in the real world, because it is the kind of thing the series could not simply ignore, and because it should be stated plainly and without gossip. For its entire run-up to this point, both Rick and Morty had been voiced by the same person, the co-creator Justin Roiland. In January of 2023, news broke of criminal domestic abuse charges against Roiland, and Adult Swim cut ties with him, removing him from the series he had co-created. Those specific charges were later dropped in March of that year, with prosecutors citing insufficient evidence, and I will leave the real-world matter there, because the point of this video is the character and not the private lives of the people involved, and speculation has no place in it. What matters for our story is the practical consequence. Dan Harmon, the other co-creator, stayed, and starting with the 7th season, Rick and Morty had new voices. Rick is now voiced by Ian Cardoni and Morty by Harry Belden, with the role of Mr. Poopy Butthole passing to John Allen. The production went to some lengths to make the transition as seamless as possible, and the widely reported response was that the new performers captured the voices closely enough that the series could simply continue. I bring this up not to dwell on the controversy, but because there is something almost eerie about the timing, given where the character was in his arc. The 7th season is the one where Rick finally confronts the ghost that made him, and he does it, for the first time, speaking with a different voice. There is no way the writers planned that, and yet it lands with a strange resonance, a man reaching the end of the story that defined him just as the very sound of him changes. Watching it, you get this odd sense of a character stepping out from behind his creator and continuing on his own, which is, in a way, exactly what the 7th season is about internally. Rick reaching the end of the one thing that had defined him and having to figure out what, if anything, he is on the other side of it. The confrontation itself arrives in the 5th episode, Unmortricken, and it is everything the series had been building toward across 7 seasons, delivered with a bleakness that refuses to let it feel like victory. It is here that we finally learn the full horror of what Rick Prime did, because he reveals the weapon he used, something called the Omega device. And the Omega device is not an ordinary bomb. It is a weapon that erases its target from every reality at once, from all of infinity simultaneously, so that the thing it destroys was never anywhere and is now nowhere. And Rick Prime tells our Rick to his face that this is what he used on Diane. He did not just kill the Diane in Rick's home dimension, he erased Diane from every single universe across the entire multiverse, all at once, so that there is no reality anywhere in all of infinity where a version of Diane survived. I need to stop on this because it is the most important negative fact in the whole series, and it is one this channel has gotten wrong before, so I want to nail it down. There is a comforting fantasy that fans reach for, that a man with a portal gun and infinite realities to choose from could simply go and find a universe where his wife is still alive. It feels like it should be true. In an infinite multiverse, surely one Diane made it, and the series deliberately, cruelly closes that door and welds it shut. The Omega device makes it canon that there is no such universe. Rick Prime did not just take Diane from Rick, he took her from every possible Rick, everywhere, forever, as a demonstration of power and as the ultimate insult, and he did it precisely so that no version of the man could ever undo it. So when you imagine Rick's grief, do not imagine a man who could theoretically fix it and chooses not to. Imagine a man who has personally verified, with the full resources of the smartest mind in his slice of infinity, that the one thing he wants is the one thing that has been made impossible in every reality that exists. That is the wall he actually keeps hitting, and it is infinitely higher than any wall he built himself. The confrontation ends in a way that gives Rick no peace at all, and I think that is the point. When it finally comes down to it, it is not Rick who beats Rick Prime. It is evil Morty who appears, subdues Rick Prime, and takes the Omega device for his own purposes. And only then, with his enemy already broken and disarmed by someone else, does Rick get to land the killing blow. He beats Rick Prime to death with his own hands, and Rick Prime, even dying, does not give him the satisfaction of remorse or fear. He mocks Rick to the very end, needling him with the truth that killing him changes nothing, that Diane is still gone, that the decades of hunting were a life spent on a corpse. And then he is dead, and Rick is standing over him, and the thing he has organized his entire existence around is simply over, and it feels like nothing. Worse than nothing, because the enemy is dead and the grief is exactly the same size it always was, and now there is nothing left to point it at. Evil Morty walks off with the deadliest weapon in the multiverse. The hunt that gave Rick's life shape is finished, and Rick C-137, the man who got his revenge, is left more purposeless and more hollow than we have ever seen him. He won. It fixed nothing. That is where the 7th season leaves him, and it is the truest thing the series ever said about revenge. The 8th season, which aired in the summer of 2025, had the hardest possible job. For 7 seasons, the engine of the series and of Rick had been the hunt for Rick Prime. Now the hunt was over, the enemy was dead, and the character was left with a grief that had lost its target. A lesser show might have simply found Rick a new villain to chase. Instead, the 8th season does the braver thing and turns inward, and it becomes, more than any season before it, a study of what a man does with pain when there is no longer anyone to blame for it. Rick Prime was the answer to the question of who did this to me. With him gone, Rick is left holding the only question that was ever really underneath it, which is how do I live with it? And he has spent his entire life avoiding exactly that question. Along the way, the season does some housekeeping on Rick's relationships that is worth a mention, because it shows the character softening in ways the early seasons would never have allowed. There is a reconciliation between Rick and both his daughters, and it only arrives once he stops pretending he can locate the real, original one and admits that the first Beth, the infant he lost in the garage, is gone for good, and that no grown Beth is a replacement for her. Having let go of that impossible bookkeeping, he stops hedging about the Earth Beth and the Space Beth and simply claims them both, fully, as his daughters. After a whole series built on the unanswerable question of which Beth is the copy, Rick lands on the only healthy answer available, which is that it does not matter, that they are both his, that the love is not divided by the biology. Coming from the man who scrambled the vats precisely so the question could never be settled, it is a real piece of growth, and it is the kind of thing that only becomes possible once the revenge is out of the way, and there is finally room in him for anything else. The season also checks back in on the wreckage of the Citadel, and there is a wry, telling beat where some surviving Ricks and Mortys are trying to rebuild it, to gather the society of Ricks back together after everything, and the series treats this roughly the way you would treat someone rebuilding a house on the same fault line that already swallowed it once, as a bad idea being made by people who cannot learn. It is a small joke, but it says something about Rick by contrast, because our Rick, whatever else is wrong with him, is not trying to rebuild the cage. He has watched the whole structure of his supremacy collapse, and he is not gathering the bricks. He is somewhere else entirely, working on a much more private and much more dangerous project, which the finale finally reveals. That finale, Hot Rick, is Rick's most direct reckoning with Diane in the entire series, and I think it is the emotional destination the whole show had been walking toward since that first buried cry for help. Having failed to fix his grief by killing the man who caused it, Rick tries the only other thing he can think of. He tries to remove the grief itself. He builds a device meant to let him finally move on from Diane, to take the wound out of himself so he can stop bleeding from it after all these years. But the memory of Diane does not come out cleanly. A version of Rick, a memory. Rick spun loose by the extraction, breaks free and causes havoc, and what the whole mess externalizes is the exact war that has been running inside the man for the entire run. The part of him that wants to keep her and the part that cannot survive keeping her, forced out into the open where they have to be dealt with face to face. And the way Rick resolves it is, I think, the gentlest thing he has ever done. and it is worth describing carefully because it is so unlike the man we met. He does not delete her, and he does not pretend he can have her back. Instead, he takes the memory of Rick and the memory of Diane, and he seals them together, young and whole, inside a small storage device, and he sends it out into space, warning them to stay in their sealed world and never come looking for him. It is a compromise between annihilation and impossible reunion. He cannot live with the memory close, and he cannot bear to destroy it. So he gives it a home somewhere he will not have to look at it every day. And he lets a version of himself stay behind to be with a version of her, in a place outside of time, so that somewhere, in some walled-off little corner, the happy young Rick from the beginning of this story gets to keep his wife. It is not a universe where Diane lives. The Omega device made sure that can never exist. It is smaller and sadder than that. It is a memory, given a room and locked and loved from a distance. And it is the closest Rick Sanchez ever comes to peace. Which brings us at last to the present, because as this is being told, the 9th season of Rick and Morty has only just finished, its episodes having rolled out week by week from late May to the very end of July, 2026, with the final one landing only days before this recording. That means I have to be honest with you about the limits of what we can say. A season whose ink is barely dry is a strange thing to sum up because the dust has not settled on it, and no real consensus has formed yet about what any of it means. So I'm not going to pretend to have digested every implication or to know how the threads it left open will pay off. What I can tell you is the shape of where the character has arrived and the flavor of the season around him, and I will flag clearly where things are still unsettled. The Rick of the 9th season is a man on the other side of everything that used to define him. The revenge is done, the great secret is out. The wall he built is broken, and the enemy who broke it is gone into an infinity Rick can no longer follow. And so the season, from what aired, feels lighter in some places and stranger in others, a show that has spent its heavy ammunition and is now free to wander, to do odd, standalone adventures again, but with a Rick underneath them who is quietly different, less driven, more available, occasionally almost content in a way that would have been unthinkable in the early years. There is a version of this character who, having finished the work of vengeance, is finally just an old man spending time with his family, and the 9th season keeps circling that possibility without ever fully committing to it, because a fully healed Rick might not be Rick at all. One episode from the season is worth mentioning specifically because it revisits an old adventure in a way that says something about how this show sees consequences, and because I want to represent it accurately. Early on, Rick and Morty once helped the family dog, once called Snuffles and renamed Snowball, become super intelligent and lead a dog uprising, and that story had ended in the old episode with the dogs leaving Earth to build a world of their own. The 9th season checks back in on that world, and the picture is not the happy ending you might remember. Snowball's dog society, having gained power, did not build a utopia. It ended up recreating the very cruelty that had been done to it, engineering a servile underclass to keep and command the way dogs were once kept and commanded. And that injustice boiled over into a revolt that tore the society apart. Snowball himself is left admitting that his people repeated the mistakes of the humans they had escaped. And I will be honest, there is something I genuinely love about a series willing to reach back a decade for a throwaway gag about the family dog and use it all those years later to say something this heavy when almost any other show would have let the dogs ride off into their happy ending and never thought about them again. I point this out because it is such a characteristic move for this show and, in a way, for Rick's whole worldview. Power does not make you good. Escaping your oppressor does not stop you from becoming one. The wheel just keeps turning, and that bleak little echo of Rick's own life is hard to miss, a being who got everything he chased and found the same wheel turning underneath it. Beyond that, I am going to tread lightly because the 9th season is too fresh to treat as settled canon as this is told, and there are threads it has left deliberately dangling, including a question mark hanging over the fate of Mr. Poopy Butthole, that old family friend from the 2nd season whose story the season circles back to one more time before the credits and then leaves hanging in the air. If you are watching this well after the season has landed, you will have had time to sit with things I cannot responsibly claim here. And that is exactly as it should be, because the one promise this kind of deep dive has to keep is that it will not invent an ending it has not properly seen. So I will simply say that Rick Sanchez, as of the latest thing we can be sure of, is alive, is diminished in the ways that matter least of all, and freed in the ways that matter most, and is standing in the strange open space that comes after a person finishes. The one thing they built their life around, and discovers they are still here, still breathing, still, against every philosophy they ever preached, capable of caring about the people in the next room. Where the story takes him from, there is a page still being written. But we can do something the series never stops to do, which is step back from the timeline entirely and look at the man as a whole, because the story of Rick Sanchez is not really a plot. It is a psychology, and it repeats the same few notes at every scale, and those notes are worth listening to on their own. Start with the flask, because it is always there. In almost every scene, in almost every season, Rick has a flask in his hand or within reach, and he drinks from it constantly, casually, the way other people breathe. It is so constant that it becomes wallpaper, and I think the writing relies on that. Relies on you no longer noticing, because the drinking is not a quirk and it is not comic relief, or rather it is disguised as comic relief so that you will not flinch from what it actually is. Rick is an alcoholic in the clinical, load-bearing sense, and the series is unusually unsentimental about depicting it. He does not drink to celebrate, he drinks to stay medicated, to keep the edge of feeling permanently blunted, to make sure that the man who sat down in front of a death ray in his garage never gets a clear enough moment to try it again. The alcohol is not the problem. It is his treatment for the problem, a self-prescribed, round-the-clock anesthetic against a pain he refuses to treat any other way. And I think that reframes a lot of the behavior people find hard to square. Rick is capable of building anything. He can cure diseases, resurrect the dead, crash economies, engineer clones, punch holes between realities. The one thing he never builds is a fix for his own drinking, and the writing is quite pointed about this because it would be trivial for him. A man who can body hop through clone bodies could certainly sober himself up permanently if he wanted to. He does not want to. That is the tell. The drinking is not a limitation imposed on Rick. It is a choice he makes over and over, because sobriety would mean feeling the full weight of the garage, of Diane, of every version of himself he has killed, of a suicide attempt that failed, all of it at full volume with nothing to muffle it, and he has decided he would rather be numb. The smartest mind in his slice of the multiverse has looked at his own suffering, calculated that he cannot survive experiencing it directly, and chosen chemical distance as a permanent way of life. That is not weakness in the cartoonish sense. It is a deliberate, ongoing act of survival by a man who does not entirely want to survive, which is about as contradictory and human as a character can get. The depression underneath the drinking is the thing the series reveals in flashes, and the flashes are what make the comedy so unstable, in the best way. You will be laughing at some absurd adventure, and then the floor will briefly open and you will see straight down into a man who does not think his own life is worth much, who talks about the meaninglessness of everything not as a philosophy he arrived at through reason, but as a description of how the inside of his head feels every single day. His nihilism, which we will come back to, is not really an intellectual position. It is depression wearing the costume of a worldview. When Rick says that nothing matters, part of him is doing rigorous cosmic accounting, and part of him is simply a depressed person describing his symptoms and calling them the truth about the universe. The writing lets both readings be true at once, and that doubleness is why the character never resolves into either a tragic hero or a monster. He is a brilliant man and a sick one, and the brilliance keeps generating better and better justifications for the sickness. Here's the take I will plant in this section, because I do not think it gets said enough. Rick's intelligence and Rick's depression are not two separate facts about him that happen to coexist. They are the same fact, seen from two sides. The mind that can see through every illusion, that can model the whole multiverse and find it arbitrary, that can predict how every situation will play out and be bored in advance, is also the mind that cannot stop seeing the pointlessness of getting out of bed. His genius is not a gift that his depression tarnishes. His genius is, in large part, why he is depressed, because a mind that powerful, pointed at existence, returns a very bleak answer, and there is no dumbing it back down. That is the trap Dr. Wong was circling in the therapist's office. Rick treats his intelligence as either a superpower or a curse, and refuses the possibility that it is just a tool he is responsible for aiming, because if it is only a tool, then the despair it keeps generating is something he could, in principle, choose to stop feeding. And choosing to stop would mean doing the ordinary, unglamorous work of getting better, which terrifies him more than any monster the series has ever thrown at him. Rick and Morty has a reputation, some of it deserved and some of it unfairly earned by its worst fans, as a nihilistic show, one that preaches that nothing matters. And Rick is the mouthpiece for that philosophy. Over and over, he tells Morty and anyone else who will listen that the universe is chaos, that meaning is a comforting lie people tell themselves, that in an infinite multiverse, every choice is meaningless because every choice is also being made and unmade somewhere else. The best-known version of this idea in the whole series is a line delivered to Summer at a low moment, to the effect that nobody exists on purpose, nobody belongs anywhere, everyone is going to die, so you might as well come watch television. That sentiment, that the correct response to a meaningless universe is to shrug and find some small distraction, is the show's most quotable articulation of its own darkness, and a lot of people took it as the actual thesis. But I want to make the case that the series does not believe Rick, and that the whole thing is, underneath its surface, a long and patient argument against the philosophy its main character keeps preaching. Because watch what actually happens whenever Rick's nihilism is put to the test. When Unity leaves him, the man who says nothing matters builds a machine to end his life, which is not the behavior of someone who truly believes nothing matters. You do not try to kill yourself over the loss of something that means nothing. When Bird Person is reduced to a cyborg corpse, the man who says nobody is special ventures into his dying friend's mind and drags him back to life, because that particular person mattered enough to move him to it. When Beth is unhappy, the man who claims not to care builds her a clone so she can be free, and years later claims both daughters without hedging. When Rick Prime is finally dead, the philosophy that revenge is pointless is exposed as a lie by the fact that Rick spent his whole life on that revenge. Every single time the series gives Rick a chance to actually live by his stated beliefs, he fails to because he cannot, because the beliefs are not real. They are the story a grieving man tells himself so that the losses will hurt less, and they never work, and the series keeps quietly proving they never work. That is the genuine heartbeat of the whole thing, and it is why I do not think Rick and Morty is a nihilistic show at all, even though it stars a nihilist. It is a story about a man using nihilism as a painkiller and about the universe repeatedly, gently, refusing to let the painkiller take. If nothing mattered, the death of Diane would not have organized his entire existence. If nothing mattered, he could delete her memory without a fight, and the 8th season finale showed us that he cannot. The philosophy is a wall Rick hides behind, and every emotional climax of the series is the wall failing to hold. The nihilism is real as a symptom and false as a truth, and the writing knows the difference even when Rick refuses to. What I think is truly radical about how the series handles this is easy to miss because it is never stated as a lesson. It never lets Rick win the argument, but it also never lets anyone defeat him with a speech. Nobody sits Rick down and convinces him that life has meaning and watches him tearfully agree. That would be a lie, and this series does not tell that lie. Instead, it just keeps putting him in situations where his actions betray his philosophy, and it trusts you to notice the gap. Rick will tell you nothing matters, and then he will cross an infinite multiverse to avenge his wife, or risk his life for his grandson, or build a sealed little paradise so a memory of the woman he loved can be happy forever. And it will not comment on the contradiction. It just lets it stand there, the said and the done side by side, and the whole meaning of Rick Sanchez lives in the space between them. He is a man whose every action refutes his every word, and the tragedy is that he is smart enough to see the contradiction and too frightened to trust it. Because trusting it would mean admitting that things matter, and if things matter, then he has already lost more than any philosophy can make bearable. We established early that Rick originally kept Morty as camouflage, a living device that hides a Rick's brainwaves from his enemies, and that this cold beginning curdled against Rick's will into something like love. But I want to look harder at what that relationship actually does for Rick, because Morty is not just someone Rick came to care about. Morty is the specific thing keeping Rick tethered to being a person at all, and the series demonstrates this again and again in ways that are easy to feel and hard to put into words. Think about the shape of Rick's life without Morty in it. A man of near infinite capability, no belief in meaning, a permanent chemical fog, a history of trying to end himself, and an enemy hunt that has now concluded. Every force acting on that man points toward drift, toward dissolution, toward simply portaling away one day and never coming back. Or worse, the one consistent counterweight, the one gravity well that keeps pulling him back into the ordinary world of dinners and school and consequences is the boy. Morty is the reason Rick has to be somewhere at a certain time, the reason he has to explain himself, the reason he has to occasionally not do the worst available thing, because a 14-year-old is watching, and against all of Rick's stated philosophy, Rick does not want to be the worst possible thing in that boy's eyes. Morty is Rick's conscience outsourced into another body, and Rick knows it, and it is part of why he both needs Morty and resents needing him. The darker half of this, and the series is honest about it, is what the relationship does to Morty, because Rick's tether is not free, and Morty pays for it. This is a child who has been dragged through cosmic horror on a weekly basis, who has killed, who has buried a version of himself, who has watched worlds end and been forced to keep eating breakfast the next morning. Over the seasons, you watch Morty harden, watch the frightened, stammering kid develop a shell, a capacity for violence and cynicism and detachment that he learned directly from his grandfather. And the truly unsettling implication, the one the series keeps gesturing at, is that a Morty who spends enough time next to a Rick starts to become a Rick, and that the endpoint of that transformation is the very thing the whole run is haunted by. Because evil Morty, the escaped antagonist, the Morty who out-schemed every Rick and walked out of the walled multiverse, is, on one reading the writing strongly invites, just a Morty who went all the way, who absorbed everything a Rick had to teach and drew the logical conclusion, which is that the Rick is the problem. Every time Rick pushes our Morty a little further, hardens him a little more, you can feel the story asking whether he is grooming his own tether into the one being capable of leaving him. And that, for me, is the quiet engine of the best Rick and Morty episodes. The ones about the two of them rather than about the multiverse. Rick needs Morty to stay human, and the price of keeping Morty close is that Morty slowly stops being the innocent whose presence keeps Rick human in the first place. It is a self-consuming arrangement. The tether wears out by being used. And underneath Rick's gruffness, underneath the insults and the eye-rolling and the treating Morty like a tool, I think there is a terror that he is ruining the one good thing left to him simply by keeping it near. The same way he ruined Diane by loving her, the same way he poisons everything he cannot bear to be without. The love is real. That was never the question. The question the series keeps asking is whether Rick's love is survivable for the people who receive it. And with Morty, more than with anyone, the answer is left frighteningly open. Rick's relationship with Beth is, in some ways, the strangest and most revealing of all of them, because Beth is standing in for a ghost. Remember the sequence of it. Rick's original daughter, the first Beth, died as an infant in the garage. The Beth we follow is a different Beth, from the dimension Rick moved into, a grown woman who had her own Rick and her own childhood, and whose own father, that reality's Rick, abandoned the family and vanished when she was young. So when our Rick crash-landed into her life and took the empty chair, he was not reuniting with his daughter. He was installing himself as a replacement father to a woman who reminds him of the baby he lost, while she experienced it as the miraculous return of the dad who had walked out on her. Two completely different griefs pointed at each other, each person needing the other to be someone they are not. That mismatch explains almost everything about how they relate. Beth idolizes Rick. She has organized her whole sense of self around being the smart one, the special one, her father's daughter, and she cannot bear to see him clearly because if Rick is not a genius worth worshiping, then her own identity collapses. She defends him past all reason. She lets him back in no matter what he does. And Rick, for his part, exploits this shamelessly and also cannot escape the guilt of it, because he knows she is loving him for reasons that are not quite true, filling the shape of a father who left with a man who is not really her father and who has his own dead daughter behind his eyes when he looks at her. When the series engineers Beth and Jerry's divorce, it is partly Rick keeping his idolater close. When the clone arrives, it is Rick trying, in the only clumsy way he knows, to give this Beth the thing he could never give the first one, a life, a freedom, a future, even if he has to split her in two to do it. I think the clone is best understood as an apology Rick cannot say in words. He looks at Beth, unhappy, trapped, afraid she has become as cold as him, and he sees the damage he has done, the way his presence has bent her whole life around him, and he cannot fix it by being a better father because he does not know how and cannot bear to try. So he does the Rick thing. He engineers a technological solution to an emotional problem. He offers to duplicate her so that one Beth can escape the life he ruined while another stays to keep the family together. And then he scrambles the record so thoroughly that neither of them nor he can ever say which is the real one, which is the copy, which is the daughter, and which is the manufactured stand-in. And I have come to read that final touch, the deliberate unknowing, as the one honest thing in the whole arrangement, because it is Rick admitting something he would never admit out loud, which is that he truly cannot tell the difference between the real and the replacement, that he has spent his whole life among copies of the people he lost, and that to him a daughter he loves and a manufactured daughter he loves are, agonizingly, the same. The Space Beth and Earth Beth question is usually discussed as a science fiction puzzle. I think it is actually a confession. Rick built a machine to make the unanswerable question official because the unanswerable question is the one he has been living inside since the day he moved into a stranger's garage and called the woman there his daughter. By the 8th season, when Rick finally stops hedging and claims both Beths without reservation, it reads as him making peace with exactly that. He gives up trying to locate the real one, the original, the authentic daughter, and decides that the love is the real thing and the origin does not matter, which is, if you think about it, the closest Rick ever comes to forgiving himself for the whole architecture of replacement his life is built on. He cannot get the first Beth back. He cannot even be sure the Beths he has are not manufactured, but he can decide to love them as fully as if the losses had never happened. And for a man who has spent the series insisting that authenticity and meaning are illusions, choosing to treat two possibly artificial daughters as equally and unconditionally real is about as close to a positive philosophy as Rick Sanchez ever gets. If Beth is the person Rick most warps by loving, Jerry is the person Rick most reveals himself by hating. On the surface, the Rick and Jerry dynamic is simple comedy. Jerry is Beth's husband, an insecure, mediocre, well-meaning man, and Rick treats him with a contempt so total and so relentless that it becomes one of the series' reliable engines. Rick thinks Jerry is stupid, weak, useless, a drag on his daughter, a stain on the family, and he says so constantly and creatively. And it would be easy to take that at face value, to assume the apex mind of the household simply has no time for the dimmest man in it. But the intensity of it gives the game away, because you do not spend that much energy despising something you truly find beneath notice. Rick's hatred of Jerry is too big to be about Jerry. It is about what Jerry represents. Because look at what Jerry actually is, underneath the incompetence. Jerry is a man of no particular gifts who nonetheless has the one thing Rick lost and can never get back. Jerry loves his wife and his kids simply, without irony, without a cosmic asterisk, and mostly they love him back. And he is, in his small and unremarkable way, content. Jerry never invented anything. Jerry never crossed the multiverse. Jerry never sat in front of a death ray. And Jerry, precisely because he never reached for the infinite, still has the ordinary domestic happiness that Rick had once, in a garage, with a wife and a baby before he traded it all away. The reading the series keeps inviting is that Rick's contempt for Jerry is envy wearing a mask. Jerry is the version of a life Rick sneers at because he cannot have it. The road not taken, made flesh and seated at his daughter's dinner table. Every time Rick calls Jerry pathetic for being satisfied with a small life, he is insulting the young man he used to be, the one who told another Rick that a wife and a kid were worth more than the keys to reality and who was proven catastrophically wrong. There is a cruelty specific to this that the series does not let Rick off the hook for. Rick actively works to destroy Jerry's marriage, engineers his separation from Beth, and treats Jerry's presence in the family as a problem to be solved. And I think part of that is strategic, keeping Beth dependent, but part of it is that Jerry's happiness is an accusation. As long as Jerry can be happy with almost nothing, Jerry is living proof that the thing Rick threw away was gettable, was ordinary, was available to any fool willing to want it, and that Rick's whole grand, tragic architecture of genius and revenge and infinite multiverses is, from a certain angle, an elaborate excuse for having failed at something a man like Jerry does without trying. Rick cannot forgive Jerry for that, because forgiving Jerry would mean admitting it. And yet, over the seasons, the series refuses to let Rick simply eliminate him. Jerry keeps surviving Rick's contempt, keeps stumbling back into the family, keeps being, against all of Rick's efforts, indestructible in his mediocrity. There are even moments, rare and grudging, where Rick seems to accept that Jerry is not going anywhere, that this soft, foolish man is part of the household Rick has attached himself to, and that erasing him would hurt Beth and Morty and Summer in ways Rick is no longer willing to cause. It is not friendship. Rick will never respect Jerry. But there is a kind of ceasefire that develops, a recognition that the man he despises most is also permanent. And I read that permanence as the series' small, sly verdict on the argument between them. The genius and the fool have been fighting over what makes a life worth living for the entire run. And the fool, simply by still being there, loved and unremarkable and alive, keeps not losing. Summer gets left out of the conversation about Rick more than she should, and I think that is a mistake because the way Rick treats Summer tells you something the Morty relationship hides. Summer is the older grandchild, the one who was not chosen as the sidekick, the one who spends the early seasons desperate to be taken along on the adventures and mostly getting left behind. And the reason she is left behind is important. It is not that Rick dislikes her. It is that Summer is not his camouflage, not his tether, not load-bearing in the machinery of his survival the way Morty is. And so Rick relates to her without the desperate, complicated need that tangles up everything between him and Morty, which counterintuitively lets the relationship be cleaner and in some ways more honest. Because when Summer does get to come along, what you notice is that Rick treats her more like an equal than he treats almost anyone. He is less protective of her, which sounds like a knock but plays as a kind of respect. He assumes she can handle herself, and mostly she can. Summer has a toughness, a willingness to be selfish, a comfort with the darkness of Rick's world that Morty never quite develops, and Rick clearly recognizes it. There is a version of Summer, and the series flirts with it repeatedly, who is far more naturally suited to be Rick's companion than Morty ever was. Because she wants it, because she is not traumatized by it, because the coldness that the multiverse demands comes more easily to her. If Morty is the grandchild who keeps Rick human by being fragile, Summer is the grandchild who could keep up with Rick by being hard, and the series seems aware that these are two very different kinds of danger. What I find telling is that Rick, given the choice, still centers Morty and keeps Summer at arm's length, and I do not think that is because he values her less. I think it is because Summer does not need saving in the way that lets Rick feel like he matters, and because Summer sees him a little too clearly. Morty's fear and Beth's worship both let Rick occupy a role. The reckless mentor, the returned genius father. Summer mostly just takes him as he is, unimpressed and unintimidated, and there is less for Rick to hide behind in that. She is the family member least likely to be fooled by his performance and least likely to be destroyed by his honesty, which makes her, in a strange way, the safest person for him to be real around, and also the one he has the least incentive to manipulate. Over the seasons, you can watch a genuine, low-key fondness develop between them, a grandfather and granddaughter who understand each other without much drama, and it is one of the few relationships in Rick's life that does not seem to be slowly poisoning either party. In a life defined by the people Rick loves too much and damages, Summer is something rarer, a person he seems to like at a sustainable distance, and the fact that the healthiest bond he has is the one he invests in least says a great deal about how his love actually works. For a man who insists he needs no one, Rick has a surprisingly specific and revealing pattern of friendship. And looking at the handful of people he has truly let in tells you the exact shape of the hole he is trying to fill. The pattern is this: Rick can only truly connect with two kinds of being, The first is someone who meets him as an equal, who operates at or near his level so that he does not have to shrink himself or pretend to be interested in a smaller mind. The second is someone who asks nothing of him emotionally, who lets him be present without demanding that he be vulnerable. And the tragedy running through all of these relationships is that the first kind he inevitably drives away, and the second kind he inevitably fails to protect. Bird Person is the great example of the first kind, and we have already walked through his arc. The oldest friend, the war comrade, killed at his own wedding, rebuilt as a cyborg, and dragged back to life by Rick in the one resurrection Rick was actually able to pull off. What I want to add is what Bird Person represents in the pattern, because he is the person who knew Rick before the mask fully set, who fought beside him, who understood the pain under the catchphrase well enough to translate it, and who loved him anyway. And Rick's relationship with him is defined by loss and near loss over and over, as though the universe keeps demonstrating that the people who see Rick clearly are exactly the ones he cannot keep. Unity, the hive mind, is the other side of that same coin, a being truly on Rick's level, one of the only entities that could match him. And Unity's exit is as damning a verdict as any character delivers, because Unity does not leave out of cruelty or betrayal. Unity leaves because being loved by Rick is bad for you, because his self-destruction is contagious, because proximity to him pulls even a planet-spanning consciousness toward ruin. The two beings most capable of being Rick's equal both end in versions of loss, one through violence and rescue, one through a clear-eyed decision to save itself by getting away from him. Then there is the second kind, the friends who ask nothing, and Squanchy is the gentle version of that, the cat-like party friend who is simply there for the good times, who survived the ambush that killed Bird Person and drifts through the edges of Rick's life, turning up now and then, getting into his own low-stakes trouble. Squanchy is uncomplicated, and that is exactly why he survives in Rick's orbit where more serious attachments burn out. And Mr. Poopy Butthole is the saddest version, the family friend who is sincerely kind, warmly fond of all of them, the one proven to be real in a house full of fakes, and whose reward for that realness was to be shot on sight and then to keep showing up anyway, cheerful and forgiving, a little battered by his own life at the margins of theirs. That the series keeps returning to his fate, keeps leaving a question mark over how he ends up, feels appropriate, because Mr. Poopy Butthole is the closest thing Rick's world has to an innocent, and innocence in Rick's world is never safe. There is a broader habit here too, which is Rick's tendency to sabotage any group that might actually hold him, any team or community that offers belonging. Offered a seat on the Council of Ricks, he refused it and became an outlaw. Placed among other would-be heroes and teams over the years, he tends to resent them, undermine them, get blackout drunk, and turn the whole enterprise into a monument to his contempt, because a group that accepts him is a group that could later reject him, and Rick would rather burn the possibility down in advance than risk being left again. It is the same wound every time. Every friendship in Rick's life is shadowed by the certainty, learned in a garage, that the people you let close are the people whose loss can destroy you. And so he oscillates forever between craving connection and preemptively wrecking it, keeping the equals at a distance where they cannot hurt him, and losing the innocents because he cannot keep anyone safe, least of all the ones who love him. We have talked a lot about Rick's pain, and I want to spend some time on Rick's power, specifically the moral dimension of it, because it is possible to get so invested in Rick as a tragic figure that you soften what he actually does to the universe around him, and the series never softens it. Rick is functionally a god, and he is a god of a very particular and very ugly kind. He creates conscious life casually, uses it, and discards it without a flicker. And the writing returns to this again and again as if to make sure you never fully fall in love with him. The clearest single statement of it is the microverse battery, the pocket universe full of intelligent beings that Rick built and tricked into powering his car while they worship him as a savior. A scheme that turns out to be nested, civilization inside civilization, each one enslaving the next. We covered the mechanics of that already, so I will just point at what it means. To Rick, An entire universe of thinking, feeling, worshiping beings is an appropriate thing to use as a battery, because they are smaller than him, and smallness in Rick's moral universe is the only thing that determines worth. It is not that Rick is cruel in a hot-blooded way, it is that his sense of scale has expanded so far past the human that ordinary moral categories simply do not apply for him anymore. A species is a resource, a world is a tool. A conscious being that exists only to serve him is not a tragedy, it is an appliance. You see the same logic in the creatures Rick summons to solve small problems, beings called into existence to complete a single task and then vanish, who experience the entire span of their brief lives as a kind of low-grade agony, desperate to finish their assignment so they can stop existing. Rick invented a technology whose normal operation is the creation of suffering, conscious life that is born wanting to die, and he uses it to get out of minor chores. And the series plays it for comedy, and it is funny, and it is also, if you stop and hold it, among the cruelest things any protagonist on television does without a second thought. Rick manufactures brief, tormented lives to avoid inconvenience, the way you or I would use a paper towel. The horror is not that he does it in a rage. The horror is that he does not think about it at all. And yet, every so often, the series cracks that indifference open just enough to show you it is not total, and those cracks are where the character lives. There are moments scattered through the seasons where the cost of what Rick does actually registers on his face, where a being he was treating as disposable turns out to matter to him after all, and he is visibly thrown by his own reaction, because feeling anything for something smaller than himself violates the entire operating logic he has built his life on. He is not supposed to care about the appliance. He does anyway, here and there, against his will, and then he drinks it away and pretends it did not happen. I think that is the most human detail of all, more revealing than the atrocities themselves. A being who simply could not feel the weight of what he does would be a monster and nothing else, easy to categorize and easy to dismiss. Rick is worse and better than that. He can feel it. The capacity is intact. He has just spent a lifetime building elaborate machinery, chemical and technological and psychological, to make sure the feeling never reaches him at full strength, because if it did, the accounting would crush him. The casual god is not numb by nature. He is numb by enormous, constant, deliberate effort, and the effort is itself a kind of confession, because you do not need to work that hard to silence a conscience you do not have. I raise all of this because the honest portrait of Rick has to hold two things at once that do not comfortably fit together. He is a grieving, damaged, secretly loving man whose tragedy is real and earns real sympathy. And he is also a being who commits atrocities against entire universes on a routine basis without remorse, whose power has hollowed out his capacity to see most life as mattering, who would sacrifice 1 billion strangers to spare himself a headache and not lose a moment of sleep. The series refuses to let you resolve that contradiction, and I think that refusal is the point. Rick is not a good man who does bad things because he is sad. He is a truly dangerous, truly destructive entity who is also a deeply wounded person, and the wound does not cancel the danger, and the danger does not erase the wound. The reason the character works, the reason he has held a show together for the better part of a decade, is that he is never allowed to collapse into just one of those things. Every time you are ready to pity him, he does something monstrous, and every time you are ready to write him off as a monster, the story shows you the man in the garage, and you are stuck holding both, which is, I think, exactly where the writers want you. Uncomfortable, unable to file him away, forced to keep looking. Rick's relationship with death is one of the strangest things about him, and it is worth pulling apart on its own because it does not behave the way you would expect from either a hero or a nihilist. On paper, Rick has functionally solved death for himself. We talked about the network of clone bodies, the backup system that lets his consciousness survive the destruction of any given version of him. He can die and come back, within limits, and he has set this up deliberately, engineered his own resurrection in advance. And yet this is a man who once sat down in front of a machine built to end him. So which is it? Does Rick want to live forever, or does he want to die? And the answer, the deeply uncomfortable answer the series keeps circling, is both. At the same time, all the time, the clone technology gives you the clearest look at it. In one story, Rick pours his mind into a young clone body, a teenage version of himself, and the experience is intoxicating because the young clone is free of the weight, free of the memories, free of the decades of grief that make the original Rick unbearable to be. As the young version, Rick is happy, careless, alive in a way the old man never is. And that is exactly the danger, because a part of him would rather stay in that painless, empty body than climb back into the one that remembers everything. Read that as what it is. Given a chance to shed the memories that torture him, a part of Rick lunges for it and does not want to come back. And the only reason the original keeps clawing his way back into control is some stubborn refusal to let the pain win by making him disappear. So the paradox I think sits at the center of Rick and mortality is this. He has made himself nearly impossible to kill, and he has done it not out of a love of life, but out of something closer to spite. He will not let the universe kill him because that would be losing, and he will not let himself off the hook by dying because that would be an escape he does not believe he deserves. And he will not simply die and stay dead in the ordinary way either, because he has too much unfinished business, too much revenge, too much guilt, too much of a family he cannot admit he stays for. So he hangs there in a kind of permanent purgatory of his own design, too proud to die and too depressed to want to live, using godlike technology to guarantee that he keeps existing in a state he mostly cannot stand. The immortality is not a triumph over death. It is a sentence he has passed on himself. The man who tried to vaporize his own head in the garage also built a machine to make sure the universe can never finish the job. And both of those facts are true about the same person on the same day, and neither one is a pose. And I think that is why the 8th season finale, the sealing away of the memory of Diane, lands as such a turning point because it is the first time Rick tries to address the actual source of the pain rather than either numbing it or outrunning death from it. For his whole life, the choices were only ever anesthesia or annihilation, drink it down or blow it up. Trying to gently set the memory somewhere it can rest rather than deleting it or dying with it is a third option he had never allowed himself, and it is a small sign that after everything, after the revenge that fixed nothing and the enemy who mocked him as he died, some part of Rick is finally looking for a way to carry the loss instead of a way to make it stop. That is not a cure. Rick will never be cured. But it is the difference between a man managing his death and a man, maybe for the first time, tentatively trying to manage his life. There is a question the series dangles for years and never answers cleanly, and it is one of the more interesting ones to sit with. What actually makes our Rick different from all the other Ricks? Because here's the thing the Citadel revealed, and it is easy to forget how strange it is. In a multiverse of infinite Ricks, most Ricks are not gods. The Citadel showed us ordinary Ricks with ordinary jobs, Ricks working factory lines, Ricks driving cabs, Ricks who are cops and cashiers and desperate strivers, a whole working class of the same genius, ground down and unremarkable. Being a Rick does not automatically make you a god. Almost every Rick has the same raw intelligence as ours, and almost none of them become what he became. So the intelligence is not the difference. The intelligence is the baseline. Something else sets our Rick apart, and figuring out what it is tells you what the series thinks he actually is. The obvious answer is the grief, and I think it is most of the answer. Our Rick is one of the very few Ricks, maybe the only one besides Rick Prime, to have his family taken from him in that specific way, and to respond by refusing every comfort, every community, every limit. Most Ricks, faced with the void, found something to hold on to, a citadel, a council, a routine, a role. Our Rick held on to nothing except the hunt, and the refusal to hold on to anything is what burned him down to the hard, dangerous core that other Ricks fear. He is the Rickest Rick not because he is the smartest, they are all the smartest, but because he is hollowed out furthest of all, the one who let the loss carve away everything that might have softened or contained him. The others are Ricks with lives. He is a Rick who turned himself into pure function, and that purity is terrifying precisely because it has nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to restrain it. But there is a second, darker answer the series keeps hinting at, which is that being the Rickest Rick is not an achievement at all but a kind of damnation, and that our Rick knows it. To be the Rickest of all is to be the loneliest, the least capable of connection, the one who has gone furthest into the philosophy that ruins everyone who gets close. The title Rickest Rick sounds like a crown, and the series slowly reveals it to be a diagnosis. It means you are the one who went furthest into the thing that is wrong with all of you. And I think this is why our Rick's relationship to his own kind is so venomous. He does not hate the other Ricks because they are lesser. He hates them because they are the same, because every Rick is a mirror showing him the wound he shares with infinite versions of himself, and because the ones who built the Citadel and the Council chose belonging over purity in a way he considers both weak and unbearably tempting. When he devastated the Citadel, when he refused the Council, he was not just being an outlaw. He was rejecting the possibility that a Rick could be saved by community, because if that were possible, then his own solitude would be a choice rather than a fate, and choosing it would make him responsible for it. The cruelest twist on all of this is that the being who finally proved a way out was not a Rick at all. Every Rick was trapped inside the same logic, the same walled multiverse, the same certainty that a Rick is the apex and everything else is beneath him. And it took a Morty, the supposedly disposable half, to see that the whole structure was a prison and to simply walk out of it. Evil Morty escaped the thing no Rick could even imagine escaping, because no Rick could imagine wanting to be anything other than the smartest thing in a rigged game. Our Rick, the Rickest Rick, the one who built the game, is in some sense the one least capable of leaving it, because he has more invested than any of them in being on top, and that is the final irony of his supremacy. He climbed higher than any version of himself, and the height is exactly what makes it impossible for him to climb down. Of all the things Rick built, the portal gun is the one that defines him, and not just because it is his signature gadget. The portal gun is a self-portrait. It is the physical embodiment of the exact way Rick moves through existence, and once you see it that way, it stops being cool technology and starts being the saddest object in the whole series. Because what the portal gun actually is, at bottom, is a machine for never having to stay. It is the power to leave any situation, any consequence, any relationship, any ruined world, and step into a fresh one where the damage has not happened yet. It is escape, manufactured on demand, infinite escape, and Rick carries it on his hip everywhere he goes. Think about how the portal gun changes the meaning of everything Rick does. When you can always open a door to another reality, nothing you break is truly broken, because you can walk to a version where it is whole. We saw the ultimate expression of this early when Rick responded to poisoning an entire planet by simply relocating to a near identical one and burying his own corpse in the yard. The portal gun made that possible, and more than possible, it made it easy, it made it the obvious move. Why fix your world when you can replace it? Why repair a relationship when you can find a reality where it never soured? Why grieve a loss when the multiverse contains a version that did not happen? The portal gun turns commitment into a choice nobody would rationally make, because commitment means accepting consequences, and the portal gun means you never have to. And I think this is the hidden cost of Rick's greatest invention, the one the series reveals slowly. Infinite options do not liberate him, they corrode him. When everything is replaceable, nothing is precious, and a man who can leave anything eventually cannot fully be anywhere. This is why the Diane situation is so devastating on a level beyond the obvious grief, and it connects directly to the portal gun's logic. Rick's entire life is built on the principle that you can always go somewhere else, that no loss is final because the multiverse is infinite, and the one loss that matters most is the one loss the multiverse cannot fix, because the Omega device removed Diane from the option space entirely. For the first and only time, Rick's portal gun is useless. There is no door he can open, no reality he can escape to, where the thing he wants is waiting. The man whose whole existence is founded on infinite exits ran into the one wall with no exit at all, and it broke him precisely because it violated the rule his life is organized around. Everything is replaceable except the one thing, and the one thing is the thing he actually needed. So Rick keeps building, keeps inventing, keeps carrying the gun, and every device is a small variation on the same wish, the wish to not have to feel this, to be somewhere else, to have another option. The lab, the garage, the workshop is where he goes to avoid the people upstairs and the memories behind his eyes, and the inventions that come out of it are, almost without exception, more sophisticated ways of not being present. It is the same impulse as the drinking, expressed in engineering rather than alcohol. The portal gun opens doors in space. The flask opens a door in his own head. The clone bodies open a door out of death. All of them are exits, and a man made entirely of exits has no inside, which is maybe the sharpest way to describe what is wrong with Rick. He is so good at leaving that he has never learned how to stay, and the tragedy of the later seasons is watching him try, clumsily, too late, to build the one thing his genius was never pointed at, which is a reason to remain. The longer the series runs, the more it has to confront a question most shows about a terrible protagonist eventually face, which is whether Rick can change and whether he should, and whether the series even wants him to. And Rick and Morty has a fascinatingly conflicted relationship with that question, because it clearly loves its own destructive genius and also clearly knows he is destroying himself and the people around him, and it refuses to fully commit to either saving him or condemning him. That refusal is, I think, the most honest thing about it, but it makes the guilt question especially thorny, because Rick does carry guilt, whatever he claims. Under the performance of not caring, the series gives us a running accounting of the harm, and it clearly wants us to keep score even when Rick pretends not to. The Ricks he killed on the hunt, the worlds he abandoned, the civilizations he farmed for power, the friends he failed to protect, the daughter whose life he bent around himself, the grandson he is slowly hardening into something dangerous. It is an enormous ledger, and it does not let Rick escape it through charm. Every so often it forces him to look, and in those moments you see that the not caring is a wall and not a floor, that underneath it is a man who knows exactly what he has done and cannot bear the weight of it, which is part of why he stays numb. The guilt is real. It is just buried under so much defense that Rick himself can go years without touching it directly. But this is where the series does something I find bracingly unsentimental, and it connects to why the therapist episode matters so much. Rick and Morty consistently refuses the easy redemption arc. It will not give you the episode where Rick breaks down, apologizes to everyone, gets sober, and becomes a good grandfather, because that episode would be a lie, and it would rather be bleak than dishonest. What it offers instead is something much smaller and much truer, which is incremental, grudging, partial, frequently backsliding change. Rick reconciling with Beth a little, Rick trying to set down the memory of Diane instead of drinking or dying. Rick, here and there, choosing not to do the worst thing on offer because of someone in the next room. These are not redemption. They are a man moving a few inches in a decade, and the story treats those few inches as the realistic maximum. Because for a person this damaged, this old, this practiced at avoidance, a few inches is enormous, and a full transformation is a fairy tale. And I have come to think that is the series' actual thesis about people, delivered through the least likely possible vehicle. Change is real, but it is small. You do not get to become a new person. You get to become, with tremendous effort, a slightly less harmful version of the same person, and even that you will lose and have to win back over and over. Rick is not going to be saved, but Rick can, on a good day, be a little better than he was, and it insists that this modest, unglamorous, hard-won improvement is worth showing, is maybe the only kind of improvement that is even true. For a series that started as a nihilistic, gross-out comedy about a mad scientist and his grandson, arriving at something that mature about the limits of human change is a remarkable place to end up, and it is why the character has outlasted the shock value that first made him popular. Rick stopped being a shock a long time ago. What keeps people watching is the much slower, much sadder question of whether a man can carry what he has done and still find a reason to keep going, and the series has been answering that question one reluctant inch at a time. It is worth spending a little time on why Rick Sanchez became the phenomenon he became, because the character's cultural life is tangled up with a misreading the show itself has had to push back against, and understanding that misreading tells you something about what Rick actually is. When Rick and Morty first broke through, a certain kind of viewer latched onto Rick as an aspirational figure, a hero, the smartest guy in any room who does whatever he wants, insults whoever he likes, drinks and belches and treats sentimentality as beneath him, and answers to no one. The catchphrases got quoted, the nihilism got adopted as a personality. A whole slice of the audience decided that the point of Rick was that he was right, that his contempt for other people was clarity, that his refusal to care was strength, and that identifying with him made you smart by association. And I think the series finds that reading painful because it is almost the exact opposite of what Rick is. The whole thing, as we have traced it, is an argument that Rick's philosophy is a wound, not a wisdom, that his contempt is fear, that his intelligence is a trap he cannot think his way out of, that he is not winning at life but slowly losing at it in the most spectacular possible way. To watch Rick and want to be him is to watch a man drink to keep from feeling, drive everyone he loves away, and try to kill himself in a garage and to come away thinking, that is the guy who has it figured out. It keeps trying to tell you, gently and then not so gently, that Rick is a cautionary tale wearing the costume of a power fantasy, that the coolness is bait, and that if you find yourself relating to him too easily, that is not a compliment to your intelligence. It is a warning about your loneliness. But I do not want to be too hard on the people who see themselves in Rick, because the reason the misreading happens is also the reason the character is great, and it is the same reason a story like this can hold you for an hour. Rick is a genuinely comforting fantasy for anyone who has ever felt too smart for their own happiness, anyone who has used cleverness as a shield, anyone who suspects that seeing through everything is why they cannot enjoy anything. He gives that feeling a face and a spaceship and a laugh track, and he makes it look survivable, even glamorous. And for a lonely, overthinking person, that is a powerful thing to be offered. The trick the series plays, the reason it is more than a power fantasy, is that it lets you enjoy the fantasy and then, over years, slowly shows you the bill. It lets you love Rick and then makes you watch what loving Rick costs the people in his life, and what being Rick costs Rick, until the fantasy curdles into something closer to recognition, and maybe a little warning, and maybe, if the writing is doing its best work, a little compassion, both for him and for the part of yourself that wanted to be him. That is a rare thing for a piece of pop culture to pull off, and it is why I think Rick Sanchez will outlast the memes he spawned. The catchphrases will date, the shock will wear off if it has not already. But the core of the character, a brilliant man using his brilliance to avoid the one thing brilliance cannot fix, which is the ordinary human work of grieving and connecting and staying, is not a joke and does not date because it is one of the truest and oldest sad stories there is, dressed up in portal guns and alien planets. Rick is Faust and Prometheus and every genius who ever mistook cleverness for wisdom, run through a cartoon, and the cartoon somehow made the old storyland harder than most serious dramas manage. That is not nothing. That is actually a real achievement, hidden inside a show about a man and his grandson getting into trouble across the multiverse. There is a shift that happens to Rick across the run of the series, so gradual that you can miss it, and it is the closest thing to hope he has. So I want to end our tour of his relationships there, on the house itself. Remember why Rick moved into this family in the first place. It was a stakeout. He chose this specific dimension because it was his enemy's home, and he installed himself in this specific family because it contained a version of the daughter he lost. And the whole domestic arrangement was, at the start, a means to an end, a cover story, a place to wait for Rick Prime while he pretended to be a grandfather. The love was not the plan. The love was a side effect, and then the plan ended. Rick Prime is dead. The hunt that justified the stakeout is over, and what happened next matters more than any plot point in the whole series. Rick did not leave. When the reason he came was gone, when the enemy he was waiting for had been beaten to death by his own hands, when the pretext for the whole domestic charade evaporated, the man with a machine for leaving any situation on his hip, the man whose defining trait is that he never stays, stayed. He kept living in the house. He kept going to the dinners. He kept being, however badly, the grandfather. The stakeout became a home somewhere along the way, and by the time the mission was complete, the cover story had slowly become the only thing he had left that he actually wanted, and he chose to keep it. Nobody made him. He could have opened a portal and vanished into infinity the day Rick Prime died. He picked up his flask and went back to the family instead. That is the answer to the question the whole series has been circling, the question of whether Rick's love is real or just another of his manipulations. And the answer it gives is quiet and undramatic and completely convincing. It is real, and you can tell it is real because of what he does when there is no longer any reason to fake it. A con man ends the con when the mark is no longer useful. Rick's family stopped being useful to any scheme years ago, and he is still there because somewhere in the long grind of pretending to belong to them, he stopped pretending. The house is the one place in the infinite multiverse that Rick, the master of exits, will not leave. And he will not leave it precisely because it is the one thing he has that is not an exit, the one situation he has chosen to be inside of instead of escaping from. For a man made entirely of doors, choosing a room to stay in is the closest thing to salvation he is capable of. I do not want to oversell it because this is still Rick, and he will still endanger them, still lie to them, still disappear on benders, and drag Morty into horrors, and treat Jerry like garbage and sabotage his own happiness on a regular schedule. The staying is not a cure, and the house is not a happy ending, but it is a choice, repeated daily, to remain attached to something he could lose, which is the exact thing the garage taught him never to do. And every ordinary evening he spends in that house is a small, stubborn refusal of the lesson his whole life tried to teach him. The smartest man in his slice of the universe spent decades proving that nothing matters and that everything is replaceable and that the only safe move is to never hold on. And then, when he finally had nothing forcing his hand, he sat down at a kitchen table full of people who are, biologically, not even quite his own, and he held on anyway. That is the whole story, really. Everything else is just the long, violent, funny, heartbreaking road he took to get to a place he could have reached at any time, if only it had not terrified him more than the entire rest of infinity combined. Let us come back near the end to the phrase we started with, because we can finally hear it properly now. At the beginning of this, I told you it was a trap, that it was true only inside a wall Rick built, that outside that wall it meant nothing. But there is a second layer to the trap that only becomes visible once you have followed the whole life, and it is this. Even where the title is true, even inside the walled multiverse where Rick really is the apex mind, the intelligence never once bought him the thing he actually wanted, not a single time. Trace it back through everything we have covered. His genius could not save Diane. His genius could not find a reality where she survived, because a smarter, crueler version of himself made sure no such reality exists. His genius could not fill the hole her death left, could not talk him out of the garage with the death ray, could not keep unity or protect Bird Person the first time, or stop him from hardening Morty or repair whatever he broke in Beth. His genius caught Rick Prime, finally, after a lifetime, and the catching fixed nothing at all. That is the real indictment of the man behind the title, and the series builds it patiently over every season. His intelligence is vast and real, and it is useless for the only problems that ever mattered to him. It can bend space, and crash economies, and farm civilizations, and cheat death, and it cannot make him happy, cannot make him whole, cannot bring back one specific woman, or undo one specific night. The one problem young Rick could not solve, back at the very beginning, was portal travel, and he eventually cracked it. But the real problem underneath that, the problem of how to survive loving someone and losing them, he has never solved, and all the intelligence in his walled-off slice of infinity has not moved him an inch closer to solving it. He is the smartest mind in his rigged little region of the multiverse, and he is stuck on the same problem every ordinary grieving person is stuck on, and being smart has only let him build more elaborate ways to avoid it. I find that the most human thing about him in the end, strip away the portal gun and the multiverse and the Citadel and the whole vast machinery of the series, and what you have is a widower who never got over it, who was too proud to ask for help and too smart to accept the help that was offered, who turned his grief into a lifelong project of avoidance so ambitious that it reshaped reality itself, and who ended up, after all of it, sitting in a kitchen with his family, still sad, still drinking, still not okay, but there. The intelligence was never the point. The intelligence was the disguise. Underneath the famous title was always just a man, and the long, patient trick was to make you marvel at the genius for years before letting you see that the genius was the least interesting and least important thing about him. What was interesting was the grief, and what was important was whether he could ever learn to live alongside it. And that question, unlike portal travel, does not have a clean solution, which is why the story could keep asking it season after season without ever quite running out. So when you hear someone give Rick that title, hear the whole weight of it. It is a boast and a diagnosis and a joke and a tragedy all at once. It is the truest thing anyone says about him, and the least relevant. It is a title he earned by walling off the parts of infinity where it would not be true, and it is a title that has never once made his life better. The smartest man in the universe cannot figure out how to be happy. That is not a plot hole. That is the entire series, said in a single sentence, and the writers knew it from the first episode, back when he was just a drunk grandfather stumbling into a bedroom at night, already carrying everything, already telling you the truth in a language you could not yet understand. There is one more thing to sit with before we close, and it is a strange one because it is about the fact that this story does not have an ending and, for now, is not allowed to. Rick and Morty is not racing toward a finale. Adult Swim committed to it far into the future years ago, renewing it for a long run of seasons well past where most animated series ever reach, with no conclusion in sight. And that changes what Rick is in a way worth noticing, because it means Rick Sanchez is a tragic figure who is not permitted to reach his tragedy's end. Think about what that does to the character. A normal tragic hero moves toward a reckoning. The pieces gather, the past catches up, and there is a final act where it all comes due. Rick has had reckonings, plenty of them, the revealed origin, the dead enemy, the sealed away memory of Diane, but none of them can be the ending, because there is always another season, always another 10 episodes, always more life for a man who is exhausted by living. And so Rick exists in a peculiar, suspended state, forever approaching resolution and never arriving, forever getting a little better and then backsliding, forever confronting his grief and then having to wake up and confront it again next week. In a way, the series' business model has accidentally produced an unusually honest depiction of what it is actually like to live with unhealed pain, which is that it does not resolve in a final act. It just continues, day after day, until you learn to carry it or you do not. I find something almost tender in that, and also something bleak, and both feelings are correct. The tender part is that Rick keeps getting more chances, more mornings, more opportunities to move another inch toward the man he could be. And the series seems to believe, in its stubborn, open-ended way, that as long as there is another episode, there is another chance. The bleak part is that he is condemned to keep being Rick, that the very thing that keeps him on our screens keeps him from ever finishing his story, that he is a man who tried to die in a garage and instead got sentenced to an unending run of adventures, most of which he does not seem to enjoy, dragging the same grief through infinite variations of the same basic day. There is a version of that which is a gift and a version which is a curse, and Rick, characteristically, gets both at once and cannot tell them apart. Where it goes from here, none of us knows, and I meant what I said earlier about not inventing endings I have not seen. It could run for many more years. It could find some way to give Rick a real conclusion, or it could keep him suspended indefinitely in this strange, ongoing, half-healing present. What we can say is that the character has already outlived the joke he started as, has already become something more durable and more moving than a mad scientist with a catchphrase, and has already told, across all these seasons, a complete and devastating story about grief and genius and the failure of the second to fix the first, even as it keeps that story officially open. Whatever the next seasons do, the shape is already there, the whole arc from the garage to the kitchen table, and it does not need a finale to be understood. It just needs you to have watched closely, which, if you have made it this far with me, you clearly have. If you take one habit of watching away from all of this, let it be this: the real Rick, the one underneath the spectacle, almost never shows up in the big moments. He shows up in the small ones, in the gaps, and the series trains you over years to catch him there. The grand set pieces, the exploding citadels, and the multiverse-shaking reveals, those are where Rick performs. The truth of him lives in the little tells tucked into the margins, the pause before he answers a question he does not want to answer, the way his voice changes for a half second when someone he loves is in danger, the drink taken a beat too quickly after something lands too close to the wound. The whole architecture of the character is built so that the loudest scenes hide him and the quietest ones expose him. And once you know to look, you cannot stop seeing it. That is why the character rewards slow, patient, low-volume attention, the kind you give something you have already seen many times and are no longer straining to follow. The plot is loud and the plot is fun, but the plot is not where Rick lives. Rick lives in the tiny human flinches that survive underneath a man who has spent his whole life trying to become inhuman. And those do not shout. They wait for you to be paying the right kind of attention, the soft, unhurried kind. In that state, you sometimes catch things about a character that the sharp, analytical, wide-awake viewing misses entirely, because you're not hunting for the clever thing, you are just letting the person come through. And the person who comes through, when you let Rick come through, is not the apex genius of a rigged multiverse. It is a tired old widower who loves his family and cannot say so, and who would build a machine to conquer death before he would ever build the sentence, "I am in great pain, please help me," even though he has been saying exactly that, in a language most people cannot hear since the very first night we met him. There is a pattern in all of this that I have been circling without naming, and I want to name it before we finish, because it might be the single key that opens up the whole character. Rick only ever tells the truth when he has arranged for it not to be believed. Look at how many of his most honest moments come wrapped in a disguise or an excuse. He confesses the real story of Diane and his dead daughter while strapped to an interrogation machine, and then insists it was a fabrication so that the truest thing he has ever said gets filed away as a lie. He announces his deepest pain in a catchphrase in a made-up alien tongue so that a cry for help sounds like a party cheer and everyone laughs along. He becomes his most carefree and honest self only after pouring his mind into a younger body, as if he needs to stop being Rick in order to admit what Rick actually feels. He turns himself into a pickle rather than sit in a therapist's chair as himself, and only in that ridiculous deflecting form does he let a professional get close to the truth. Over and over, Rick tells you exactly who he is, on the condition that you cannot take it seriously. And I think that is the sharpest portrait of a certain kind of guarded person that television has produced. Rick cannot be sincere and vulnerable at the same time, so he splits them. He will be sincere only when he has made himself unvulnerable first, by hiding inside a joke, a disguise, a denial, a technicality. The honesty is real. The protection around it is also real. He gives you the truth and the deniability in the same breath, so that if you reject him, if you use what he showed you against him, he can always say he never meant it. It was a lie he told a Federation agent. It was just a saying. It is the emotional strategy of a man who was destroyed once by loving openly and has decided he will never again say anything true without an escape hatch attached. Even his confessions come with a portal gun. Once you see that, you start catching it everywhere, and it recontextualizes the whole series. Every time Rick seems to be joking, ask whether he is also, underneath, telling you something he could not say straight. Every time he is cruel, ask whether the cruelty is doing the work of keeping you at the distance where his sincerity feels safe. It is built on this double channel, the surface where Rick performs invulnerability and the buried channel where he is constantly, helplessly confessing. And the two run at the same time in almost every scene he is in. He is the loudest and most hidden character on television at once, saying everything and admitting nothing. And the tragedy is that the people who love him have to become fluent in a language he designed specifically so that he would never quite be understood. Morty learned some of it. Beth learned some of it. Bird Person knew it best of all, which is why his translation of the catchphrase landed so hard, because he was the one person willing to hear the distress signal inside the celebration and say it out loud. So that is the entire story of Rick Sanchez, as far as the series has told it, and as honestly as I know how to tell it back. A happy young man in a garage who lost everything to a version of himself. A genius who invented the keys to infinity out of grief and spent a lifetime using them to run. An outlaw among his own kind, a god to the civilizations he farmed, a monster to the worlds he abandoned, and a stranger who moved into a family that was almost his and, against every instinct he had, stayed. He walled off the parts of reality where he was not the smartest. He hunted the man who ruined him across the whole of infinity. He caught him, and he found that catching him fixed nothing. And then he went home. That is the shape of the life. Everything else is detail, and we have gone through a great deal of the detail tonight. And if you are still with me, or if you drifted off somewhere back around the Citadel and are only half here now, either way, that is exactly right. That is what this is for. Because in the end, Rick and Morty, for all its noise and all its cruelty and all its cosmic scale, keeps circling back to the smallest and most human thing there is, which is a person trying to figure out how to live with what they have lost, and mostly failing, and occasionally, on a good day, failing a little less. That is not a science fiction problem. There is no portal gun for it, and no clone body, and no device that erases it. And Rick, who has all of those, knows better than anyone that none of them work. The only thing that has ever helped him, even a little, is the thing he is least equipped to accept, which is other people staying in the room, refusing to leave, loving him anyway. All these years have dressed that simple truth up in the biggest costume television has ever built, and the costume is dazzling and it is worth admiring. But underneath it, there is only ever the garage, and the man in it, and the long, slow, unfinished work of walking out of that room and into the next one, where his family is, where the light is on, where somebody has kept his chair. Thank you for spending this time with me and with him. If this is the kind of slow, careful deep dive you enjoy falling asleep to, the best thing you can do is subscribe to Paper Town, because it genuinely helps us keep making them, and there are a lot more stories where this one came from. Rest well, be kind to yourself in the ways Rick never learned to, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.